first say that if you enjoy this content, please subscribe. I've added a new subscriber button with all the like and subscribe and so forth. So I'm pointing up here as a signal to myself to add it in at the beginning. But all right, the topic of this video, I was working last night at my evening job and had been thinking about Star Trek and thinking about two people in particular, classmates, former classmates of mine from high school, and how I hope that more people, I guess from my high school, watch Star Trek so they could understand me better. But I think also the fact that it has a lot of good, constructive, worthwhile attributes to it. So I wanted to make this video. I haven't made a video in a little while this week. And I remembered that I had earlier made a video. I had earlier talked about Star Trek, and I didn't want to duplicate myself. I did write an essay. It's called something like The Life of Star Trek. And I put it, it's up on Amazon. I put it up on Amazon, my bookstore. I don't think it's that, it's probably like $1.99. I can't remember exactly how much, or $2.99. I think it's $2.99. It's the lowest price that Amazon allows you as a seller to sell books and texts and so forth. But I remember doing a video, and I had already done a video on how to watch Star Wars. I don't want to fall into that trap of Star Wars and Star Trek. I had done a video on how to watch Star Wars, and it also included a lot of important information about why it's a crucial aspect of our social construct, our society, basically what good attributes it has. And I wanted to do the same for Star Trek. So when I came home, I found that nope, there's no video, at least recently, there's no video on me simply talking exclusively about Star Trek. So yay! So I get to talk, that means I get to talk about how I got into Star Trek, and I've written this right here. This is my outline on different things I wanted to cover in this video. But it talks about what parts I should talk about, like if you've never been to if you've never watched a video of Star Trek before, an episode of Star Trek. Let me get my thoughts straight. Okay, if you've never seen an episode of Star Trek before, I wanted to give you a like a grounding in the show. It's not that difficult, just whatever. I wanted to explain, what good attributes it has, how the background of the show and so forth. And then I thought, well, this is a channel, it's introspection about myself and my thoughts. So it should be about my thoughts on Star Trek personally, and that would mean like how I got into the show, and I enjoy it so much that I should explain. I wouldn't be doing a good duty if I didn't explain and motivate you, inspire you to also look at it. So if I was that interested to become a devoted Star Trek fan, I should be able to explain what inspired me to be a Star Trek fan, and maybe I can do the same for you. So let's get into some history. All right. Let me see, Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 3. Star Trek 2, well, all right, this is what my mom told me. Star Trek 3 I had seen in the movie theater in 1984. I don't remember which month, but that would have been about the time when I was watching a lot of movies. My first movie was Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. And I can't think of any movies before that I had seen in a movie theater. Of course, I had seen Sound of Music and so forth, but first one in a movie theater. And then it would make sense then. Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, came out in 1984, so I would have seen that in the movie theater. And my mom says that there was a certain thing that sparks off the movie, the inciting incident. You may have heard the inciting incident, that it's that event in the movie, the beginning, that starts off the story. I don't want to reveal what that is, although you can probably guess, perhaps, what it is. But my mom said that I wasn't so surprised at the end. Well, I wasn't so surprised when I later saw Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan on television, because I had already seen The Search for Spock in the movie theater. So it's kind of one of these things where there's a cliffhanger, and Star Trek II ends on a cliffhanger, sort of, and then Star Trek III continues from where the cliffhanger left off. So I wasn't so surprised, according to my mom. And then 1984, I also borrowed a film strip from the library. Our local library had, our local library let you borrow other things. I think way back then, they let you borrow paintings. I know soon afterward they let you borrow paintings. And obviously a film projector and film strips. And one of them was an episode of the original TV series. And I would not have seen the original TV series at all. I remember in 1984, it's interesting because we moved a few times, so in my mind I can piece together like where I was living to determine where in my personal timeline all these events fall into. I remember we were in an apartment building, and I remember playing with action figures, and I remember thinking about Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. So I was already sort of familiar with Star Trek, but I don't think I'd ever seen the original series at all until we borrowed this film strip. It was called The City on the Edge of Forever, and it's been recognized as in terms of critics and in terms of fans, it's been recognized as one of the best. In fact, the original script that had been changed between the original script and the final production, that original script won, I think it was a Hugo Award. Harlan Ellison wrote the original one. It was, from what I've read, largely rewritten into the final episode. But it's interesting, both of them won. I keep looking at the preview. That's why I'm looking toward the right. I'm going to look straight at you. Okay. So we had the film projector set against the white wall, and I'm watching it, and it barely gets into the teaser before the theme song, and it starts skipping, and evidently we weren't the only ones that had borrowed the film strip, because it had been worn and it was skipping. Maybe it was just the projector itself. So there was nothing really more about Star Trek. I had already been interested in Star Wars. I was still collecting the action figures, and then we moved to another zip code. It's where I live, it's the same city. It's even the same town. It's just a matter of, one town to the next. Each town has its own zip code. So it goes by the same name, but my mom and I just moved from one zip code to another. And in fact, now as an adult, I can easily drive there in like 10 minutes. But as a kid, I was born in 1975, and I was about 9 years old at the time, roughly. And so as a child, especially with a mom who doesn't drive, who doesn't own a car, it's a matter of taking a bus. And so it would be a long trip to a bus and then to another bus and the whole rigmarole, and then making sure you get back. And even for a little kid, that means switching school system, not school systems, same school system, same school district, but switching to a different school, all the new kids and so forth, it felt very different. So anyway, so we moved, my mom and I moved to this new area in, around October, I think it was October 4th, 1985, and it was a Friday, and I remember Misfits of Science was playing, and I missed the first episode, but I did watch Misfits of Science. Anyway, that's going off on a tangent. So it's 1985, the end of 1985, and in 1986, I was very much involved with Transformers. My best friend and I had, my best friend actually introduced me to Transformers when we were living in the other place. And then I continued, and in the new school, I found a friend who was also interested in Transformers, and other kids were interested in Transformers, although I don't think they were as passionate about it as the two, my new friend and I, and my old friend. I still kept in touch with my old friend. So the end of 1986 really could have even, I'll say December 1986. I had already been watching a show called Siskel and Ebert, and you should go back. A lot of their videos are on YouTube. It was a television show that aired in the weekends, may have been syndicated, but it may have been Sunday or Saturday. I think it was probably Sunday around noon. They would have new movies. Now, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert were already established film critics. And what differentiates that show at the movies with Siskel and Ebert from what's on now, especially what's on now, the so-called film critics, they're really just reviewers. They're not professionals. The ones they have now aren't professionals. What I really enjoy about the value of Siskel and Ebert was that they would review a movie. They would come out with like 4 or 5 movies, and that it's only half an hour. It's amazing. That's like 22 minutes or something. But they talked quickly, and they got right to the point. They covered like 4 movies at least in these episodes. Anyway, they would usually agree. I mean, the slogan, the misnomer, so to speak, or misconception is that they would always disagree. That was the catch thing. They would show them, thumbs up or thumbs down. But for the most part, they would typically agree. And they would actually talk about the characters and motivation. It was something like a short, ongoing course in how to write good stories and how good film making it should be. So anyway, probably late December 1986, which is when the movie Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home came out. I remember them reviewing it, and I don't remember anything else. If my memory isn't mistaken, I remember feeling encouraged or inspired by that, to watch this new movie, which takes place in the 20th century. And it's a comedy, and it's action, and I was already tuned to science fiction somewhat anyway. So it was probably more like January 87 when I probably actually saw the movie. And I had seen it several times in the movie theater. I remember getting a magazine about it. You can please, I don't want to give away everything. Please go to my Amazon account, and I'll include a link. I've been neglecting that, but I'll include a link, at least for this one, at least to that essay. So I don't want to give a lot away, but typically when I would go to a movie theater, especially in 1984 or 85, I would see a movie several times. So what got me interested? That's actually a good question for myself. And that ties in with these things here. First of all, they were good role models. You have a crew, and I'll explain the background of the show soon. But I saw good, positive characters interacting with each other in a constructive way. There was intrigue, there was suspense, they were just well-told stories, and it was science fiction that got me. And there was a huge what-if factor that goes along with science fiction. What if you met aliens who were like this? What if you met a society that was still in the 1930s? I'm just throwing up what ifs off the top of my head, but it was like, what if this had happened and not that, and so forth. And you know what I'm talking about, like going back in time and changing history and stuff like that. And the endings of these episodes were constructive, peaceful endings. You didn't have, well, I mean, there may be a little battle here and there, but to build up suspense, and you've got to have drama and conflict. But the resolutions at the ends of episodes were constructive and positive, and Kirk, the main character, the protagonist, was trying to resolve things without I'll say excessive conflict. Was trying to resolve things peaceably, and of course it was very colorful. Of course, I shouldn't say colorful. I'm not sure if I had a color TV at the time. I think I did have a color TV. I'm pretty sure actually I did have a color TV, because I remember having a TV in 1986 when I was watching the Transformers cartoon. I remember that was when my mom had gotten a color TV. So it was very colorful, and so there were visual, dazzling, I don't want to say special effects, but there were things in the mind that would conjure imagination. The special effects were limited, especially anyone looking at the original effects now would definitely call them dated. It wasn't that cheesy. It wasn't as cheesy as people make it out to be. I mean, it wasn't strings and so forth. It was on a television budget, and it was, despite people saying, "Oh, it's cheap props and so forth." At the time, and I've got books on this. I don't remember the title, but there's a 3-volume set. Each volume devoted to a different season. The budget was pretty high, and I can definitely see. I think it's been mentioned a few times. They were trying to cut corners. This is a television budget. They were trying to cut here and there, or I could at least understand if that happened. And despite people saying, "Oh, that was nobody really watched it," again, in that 3-volume set, they show the actual TV guide. It's not like Rumors or something where just talk from, "Oh yeah, back then, blah blah blah." No, they actually show the TV guide. They show the ratings. I think they were the Nielsen ratings. They actually show the ratings, and many times those Star Trek episodes were beating out the other, what was on the other 2 channels. Typically, it was basically 3 channels. It was NBC, ABC, and CBS. And many times it was beating out the others. So it was successful in its own time. It's just that it took some time for people to recognize that it was beating the ratings, and perhaps the ratings were hidden. The fact that they were beating, and perhaps it was hidden in order to curb the budget of the show. Who knows? That's getting into speculation. So let's get back to me and why I got into it, and why you should too. The special effects weren't dazzling so much visually, although there were lasers and so forth. It was the imagination. It was the concept. What if they didn't have the budget in the 1960s to do a show like this, but off the top of my head, it was like, what if we were shrunk and we had to navigate through as miniature people. And so, imaginative ideas. So visually, the production budget couldn't allow for something that elaborate, but in your mind you could imagine them walking around wherever they were and so forth. And that's another thing that's worthwhile about this show. It it motivated your imagination to develop, and with that comes brain power and integrating things and becoming more curious, and along with the compassion. There were a lot of moments of compassion in this show. I had mentioned before that this team of characters worked together, and there was an ethics and a morale behind it. It's not like superficial morality. It's not like goody two-shoes. It was more like recognizing humanity and being decent to each other. And I'm starting to tear up a little bit. I mean, my jaw starts feeling that strain, when you start holding back the tears. In essence, that's what it was. It was recognizing humanity and genuinely being decent to each other. And the main protagonist, Kirk, tried his best to resolve conflict compassionately and peaceably, and not let people be hurt by whatever it is, and try and prevent war, try and prevent this, and being defensive rather than offensive. You do these, you use your weapons only as a last resort. It's a little bit of MacGyver in there too, although that would have come later. So, all right. So, my point. So, I wanted to watch the original series, and it was on WPIX. It premiered sometime back. It was on WPIX, which came out of New York City, Channel 11, although on cable, my cable box, I think it was Channel 21, if I remember correctly. And it was on at midnight on weeknights. And that was on after The Honeymooners. So I would wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes this would be many times this would have been during a school night. I would wake up and watch the ending credits of The Honeymooners, and then that led into this episode. Guess what episode was my first episode? It was an episode called The Empath. Here's one for real weird, twisted irony. You have, in a typical episode of the show, you have the Enterprise, you have the bridge, you have all these colorful colorful surroundings, you have corridors, you have phasers, you have characters, a whole cast of new characters, guest characters for that episode, and then in addition to the original crew. So I just happened to watch The Empath, which was about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beaming down and finding themselves in a room of blackness, and there were just these two humanoid creatures putting them through moments of torture to analyze how they react. Through a lot of the bulk of the episode was that, and there was this one actress playing the part of a mute empath, thus the title of the episode, The Empath. And she didn't speak, and it's just how great the concept of the show was, and what I had already seen, I guess, in The Voyage Home, and probably what I remembered from way back in the earlier two movies I had seen that motivated me to continue watching. And let me say, what I'm going to say all happened in a span of just a few months. So I had gone to the library and borrowed a compendium. I don't have it here, but let me see if I can find it on the internet. I'll place it right here. I borrowed the Star Trek compendium, which was a book about that thick, perhaps, and the copy that I borrowed was red, and it was something like the 20th anniversary edition. So it was about the same year it came out, 1986, 1987. And you open it's soft cover. It's about that high. You open it up, and it starts explaining. It devotes a whole chapter to how Gene Roddenberry came up with the show and designed the show and eventually pitched it, and NBC, Desilu produced it, and then it was bought by NBC. And I'll get into that. I intend to get into that in the history part later on. And then after that, it devoted at least a few pages to each episode. It would show the episode title. It would show the summary of the episode. It would show the principal character names. And then after the summary, it was usually like a paragraph. After that, it would have a write-up about the episode, the background. It would talk about, in one section, it would talk about what the guest actors had been in other things. And it would start off with commentary, like opinions and like the author's feedback and thoughts about the episode and what he thought was interesting. And the episodes were numbered, and they would have the star date on it. Now, there are errors in there, sometimes really glaring errors, but it was a good guide, and I hadn't seen many of the episodes when I borrowed that. And in fact, it showed at the end, it even included the animated series that came later, and I'll talk about that later in the quick, brief history of the shows, actually. After the third season, it summarizes each animated episode, and you only got a summary. He didn't comment on the animated episodes, and then there are some pages devoted to the first motion picture, and then Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and then The Search for Spock, and I believe Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was included in that red covered edition. I may be mistaken. That may have come later. And then it's probably an epilogue at the end talking about it. And then at the very end, it gives a list of all the characters and the actors who played them and which episodes they were in. And in addition to that, I remember one of those times I went to watch Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, I got a I got the first of a 2-issue limited series. It was called Who's Who in Star Trek. Now, it was published by DC Comics, and they had already been printing issues, publishing issues of a comic book because they had the rights to the original. They had rights to Star Trek movies, and I believe they did have rights to the original. They had rights to all things Star Trek, which was, if I could diverge a little bit, which I believe was unique in that Gold Key Comics had come out first during the production of the TV series, and it ran for like 60-something issues. And when they were printing their issues, the original TV series in the 1960s was the only Star Trek property in existence. So they had the rights to that series. And then and then it stopped, and then the Star Trek: The Motion Picture comes out in 1979, and Marvel does a 3-issue adaptation of the movie, and then continues on with maybe 16, 15 something issues after that. I think their final issue was something like 18 for Marvel Comics, but they only had rights, from what I remember, to the movie. They couldn't mention stuff from the original series. So this was unique. DC then comes... So after Marvel's run, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan comes out, and then shortly afterwards, DC has the rights to all of Star Trek. So they could go back to the original series, they could mention the movies, and so forth. So anyway, I hadn't been involved, I had not been interested in Star Trek until Star Trek IV, really until Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. And I got the first of a 2-issue limited series, Who's Who in Star Trek, which had Kirk on the cover. I mean, it was an alphabetical list, so it just happened to be that Kirk comes before Spock alphabetically. So they were able to put Kirk on the cover. He's also the captain. And in the next issue, Spock is on the cover, and he's the first officer under Kirk. So it just happened to fall like that, but conveniently. I got this first issue, and sometime around that period, I also got an issue of the DC Comics, and this is the issue that takes place after the voyage home, I think it's called something like New Frontiers, and it's where the crew is back aboard I'll just say they're back aboard a new ship, a new Enterprise. And I got it, but I didn't read it. I figured I could collect them, and at some point when I felt familiar, when I felt comfortable, I have them, and I can just go and start reading them. But I was collecting another series very faithfully. I was collecting Transformers, and it had been, earlier that year, or earlier 1986 actually, when I bought my first issue, or my mom bought me my first issue of Transformers, and that was another issue. I won't get into that, but I've been collecting every month. I've been collecting and reading the issues of Transformers, and so this was an add-on. So I started collecting these two every month, both issues. And so anyway, going back to Who's Who in Star Trek, each page had nice illustrations. Sometimes there were 2 pages, and it wasn't just like, this is the character and these are some things about him. No. It mentioned his first appearance. It had height and weight. It had a nice, usually like a nice full-scale illustration drawn by DC animators. You could tell that they picked their best artists to do these 2 issues. And there were paragraphs upon paragraphs of not only the primary characters like Kirk and Spock and Scotty and so forth, but also like creatures and characters you'd see in just one episode alone of the original 1960s show, some of them from the animated series in the early 70s, and then the movies. So it was a guidebook. It was like, I think of it as like an encyclopedia. And I remember not having seen all the episodes at that point. This is like spring 1987. And I learned, I read these different, I remember looking through the pictures and being intrigued by the stories that they were talking about, from the point of view of, a summary of like character A's experiences on this planet, and that of course those experiences were in this episode that it mentions, like the Tholian Web or something or other. Like, for example, it would show the aliens depicted in the Tholian Web, and it would say first appearance, the Tholian Web, and it would talk about them and explain them and talk about like some of their interaction with the Enterprise. And it was a wonderful opening to Star Trek. There was another wonderful opening also from the library, where I got my Star Trek compendium. There was a series of books. James Blish took the scripts from the original series and adapted them into essentially short stories. And it's interesting, especially in retrospect now, or since, some years since the original series aired, because he was not adapting the final episodes. He was taking the original scripts and adapting them. So sometimes there are changes. There's one, The Man Trap was originally called The Unreal McCoy, and that's the title in this chapter, short story chapter. So he would take them, he would assemble them together sort of randomly in terms of episode production order, and just bind them together as volumes, like James Blish, Star Trek 1, Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3. Each book, each volume would just have, I don't remember how many episodes were in there, but just several episodes summarized. And I remember reading them. I remember going to sleep. My mom would, even when I was that old, yes, I would have been like 10 or 11, 12. I wanted to go to sleep with my mom reading to me. It's a nice thing, bond between my mom and myself. I just wanted to drift to sleep, and it's like having the radio. She would read from different books, one of them being those James Blish novels. And so I borrowed some of those, and I hadn't seen the episodes for many of these episodes. I mean, I hadn't seen the visual episodes for many of these stories, so I was going by what James Blish had written. And so you can, I'm skipping out a bit. You can go and read my essay. Let me see. So Fox Network, you know, I remember I mentioned that there was ABC, NBC, and CBS, and then you had cable television. But there was a new young upstart network called Fox, ties to 20th Century Fox, and they were brandishing themselves as having a new hip audience, or targeting a new hip audience. So they were running shows that you wouldn't see on the other networks. Early on, I remember Married with Children was very different from the typical family wholesome sitcom. It bragged, you know, practically bragged that it was. And there were weird concepts for TV series. There was, I think, Mr. President was in there, and there was a lineup. It was one sitcom. I think that came a little bit later. It takes place after the end of civilization, and you only have a few survivors. It was a sitcom about that. And there was the Tracy Ullman Show had premiered and begun, I think, right from the very beginning. It was only a few shows. It was like Tracy Ullman Show. And the Tracy Ullman Show was a kind of like the Carol Burnett Show or Saturday Night Live. They would have cartoon bits during the commercial breaks. And the cartoon breaks I'm not sure if they had other cartoons, but they had one about this certain family called The Simpsons. And I remember, all right, Married with Children, Tracy Ullman Show, and if you Locked Up, there was one with Rosanna, nuts, I can't remember her name. The actress, I want to say Roseanne Barr. It's not Roseanne Barr. It's Donald. I want to say Rosanna Donald. I'm completely making a out of myself, but I can't remember her name. Anyway, so there was this new network, Fox, and they also aired Transformers, the third season that takes place after the Transformers movie, and that had been running. So sometime around April, I think, they premiered Star Trek, the original series, weeknights it was like 6 o'clock or 7, I think it was 7 o'clock, weeknights. And so I was all excited because finally I get to see all the episodes. All I had to do was stay home and watch them. And now there are 79 episodes. It depends. I should really count to see, because one of the episodes is a two-parter, so you should count that twice. And then the pilot episode has since been included in the run, and it's called episode 80. So it's 79 or 80. I'll just call it 80. It divides up into not that many weeks. If you run it 5 days a week, it's just a month or something like that, a couple months or something, to run all the episodes and start back from the beginning. So between that and Nickelodeon on the cable cable system, my mom and I subscribed to, they were running the animated series, and there were only like 21 episodes. There was a misconception. There's some episode labeled 22, but I remember it's only 21 episodes. it didn't take long until I saw all the episodes, and I was thoroughly familiar with the Star Trek Compendium. I was reading through on a regular basis, and there was a book called, I think, the Star Trek Technical Manual. It's a black book, black covered book, soft cover, and it's a compilation of this guy's work. He was a fan, sort of. Yeah, I guess he would call himself a fan, or he could be considered a fan somewhat. There were technical drawings based on simply watching the shows a number of times. He would draw. He had a technical drawing background, so he He started off making like maps and overlays and so I'll just say architectural drawings of things you'd see in this show, and starship schematics and so forth. Schematics, that's a good word. And then they were assembled into this book called, I believe it's Star Trek Technical Manual or Officer's Manual. And so I bought that book. That was my first Star Trek reference manual, what I call Star Trek reference manual. And then sometime a little bit later, I got I do have this, the medical reference manual, and that simply shows different aliens, diagrams of different aliens. And I was just awash, like all this stuff about lore about Star Trek coming in. And what made me keep going with Star Trek? One, it's the curiosity, learning about this whole universe, and of course what I said before about compassion and good role models and what if. It really encourages your imagination. So after a few weeks, I had seen all the episodes, or a matter of a couple of months or something. I had seen all the episodes, and I was already familiar with that by the time they introduced Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I'll skip through. I don't need to tell you all about my history with Next Generation, blah blah blah. It premiered on television in the end of September 1987, and I'll tell you something that affected me personally. I'm Jewish, and I identify as Jewish, and my mom is Jewish. My dad, although I didn't grow up with him, is Irish Catholic. And in school, I don't remember how far back this was, but in school, I had already been experiencing this feeling of alienation, that the kids would tease me, mock me. I'd feel left out. I didn't really feel like part of it. So there's one character in Star Trek, Spock, who was half human and half Vulcan. And it's not so much the emotion versus the logic, although that's a part of his character too. That's a philosophical aspect of the show and of his character that people can dwell on. But I was also thinking about, to what does he identify? Is he Vulcan or human? And he's a Vulcan. He views himself as a Vulcan living amongst humans. And some things about humans irritates him. And sometimes he's mentioned that the Vulcan way is better than the human way. And sort of like the Vulcans are more mature as a society than humans. And sometimes I felt like that, especially in middle school and in high school. So my Jewish identity, my sense of Jewish identity, was akin to that. I won't go any further. All right, so let me stop here and then gather my notes. Okay, cool. All right, so I've explained my my exposure to the series and why I was so enthusiastic about it. I hope I have. And now is the fun part part for me because then I just get to explain what the show is about, the history of the show. All right, so it starts around 1963, around 63. I believe Gene Roddenberry is I believe he was in the Air Force. He was in the military, and I remember he was a police officer, and he had been writing for TV shows like Have Gun Will Travel and Dragnet and so forth. And I specifically remember him writing an episode as a police officer. With police officer experience, it makes sense that he would write an episode of Dragnet. So he's relatively mild speaking, and he has this concept of a futuristic show on a spacecraft, and they're exploring outer space. And a lot of people, I won't go into detail on this, and I haven't even explored. It'd be fun and fascinating. There are documentaries about this, covering exactly what inspired him in this way and that way. I'll just simply say that about a decade before that, there was a famous science fiction movie called Forbidden Planet, which has some parallels with this in that there's a sense of a united Earth, and there's a spacecraft with explorers, and there's a planet that they land on, and so forth. And I think that contributed a lot to the inspiration for this show. He said at one point he wrote a series Bible. What's a series Bible? It's something that show creators write when they're designing their show. I've written some, and it starts off with the premise. What's the premise of this show? The premise of this show is it's a family sitcom. The premise of this show is a workplace sitcom. It takes place in a court system. The premise of this show is a police drama. Okay, so he and then in the Bible, the series Bible, you would have that, and then you talk a bit about the show, the basic background, what's going on in the show, and then you mention the primary characters. That would be on week to week to week, and some episode ideas, and some sets and concepts behind the show. So this is very unique concept, having a show in the future on a spacecraft with a crew. Already you're running into new territory, no pun intended. You can't use advertisers. You can't advertise cigarettes. You can't advertise various products because they wouldn't exist in the future. So at some point, he says, in the beginning of the series Bible, he says, it's the future. It could be 1999 or even 2999. In other words, it's far enough in the future that we have progressed as a culture. You have a sense of a more united Earth where nations are working together and exploring space. And yet, it's close enough to our century that you can recognize them as humans, and there's something familiar. You can relate to them as characters and their surroundings as characters. And he also said that there's an actual audience out there. I believe this is in the first. I believe this is in the Bible pitch for the original show. I don't think it's in the pitch for the one for the second effort at a show. In other words, after the original show ended, he made a pitch for Star Trek Phase 2, and I believe it's in the pitch for this one. He says that essentially there's an audience out there with minds, and in so many words he was saying they're smart, and we don't have to talk down to them. We can tell stories and appeal to their imaginations. And they're actually smart. They're curious. We should appeal to that. So there was a TV show at the time that was very popular. Westerns were very popular at the time. They were perhaps going out on their way out. This is in the early 60s, heading toward the mid 60s. So you already had Gunsmoke, you had Wagon Train, you had Rawhide was, I think, in the 50s, so forth. And radio was still existing, and you had Westerns there too. So he had to find some way to pitch this show because it's really futuristic on a spacecraft. And the common way of pitching things, even in movies, they probably still do it. It's, you have there was a movie, Water. I can't remember the name of it. Waterworld. Well, what is it? Well, it's Mad Max on jet skis. What's Duel? Well, it's Jaws, except the shark is a truck, and you get the idea. Like, it's this plus this equals something fresh. It's like Legos. So the Westerns were popular at the time. So he said, well, it's a wagon train to the stars. We'll have this ship that will be our wagon, and it's moving through new territory, and it's heading west, And in this case, heading west means going out and exploring space. And he also, I was going to say heavily, he did steep it in naval tradition. He used references from the Navy, like captain, commander, lieutenant, lieutenant commander. So the ranks you'd find in the Navy were transferred over to this show. And you had a captain, first officer, and so forth. You had a starship, which was like a naval battleship, and or a cruiser ship. And it would protect nearby Earth colonies, which is something like the United States with its Navy and its ships going out and protecting U.S. interests and islands and protectorates and so forth, and other countries allied with the U.S. and was exploring new phenomena, new civilizations. And so that is a pretty simple concept. So there are a few books that I guess I should recommend a book. There are two books by David Gerald, who wrote he wrote one of the episodes of the original series, got credit for it, The Trouble with Tribbles, and I believe he did some work on the previous episode, I Mud, if I remember correctly, reading correctly, although he didn't get credit for it. And then he's since written an episode for the animated series, and then he became part of the staff and actually co-wrote, or he had a good amount of contribution to the first premiere episode of the new series in the late 1980s. So, and then he'd written those two books, and he'd been pretty vocal in Star Trek, the Star Trek community. I recommend two books that he had written, The Trouble with Tribbles, which is the namesake of the actual episode he wrote, but it tells the story of how he started off just as a fan watching, not even a fan, he just curious about the show when it premiered, and then he followed the episodes through that first season, and he wanted to write for the show. Luckily, he was already in Los Angeles, which helps. And it tells a story of how he developed the concept, how he pitched these different other concepts for TV, episodes, and one of them was chosen, which is the Tribbles episode, and then he writes that episode, and then he goes through draft after draft. He meets Gene Roddenberry and so forth. So I'd recommend that book. There's another book by him called The World of Star Trek, where he talks more philosophically about concepts in the show and their meaning, their deeper meanings and concepts and so forth. And I'll also mention a third book to give you a good grounding. It's called The Making of Star Trek. This may be the first ever book, a nonfiction book about the show. It was written by Stephen Whitfield, and Gene Roddenberry. And it was published somewhere before the third season, I think, even premiered, because it was like 1968. So it explains a lot about the background of the show, the production of the show, certain anecdotal stories, and also tells you about the characters, their backgrounds, and so forth. So and it also has a nice summary of what rooms are on each deck of the ship. You know, deck 1 is the bridge, deck 2, 3, 4, decks 2 and 3 are science stations, decks 4 to 6 are crew quarters and engineering and so forth. So it explains the ship layout. So I recommend those. Anyway, going back to the pitch. So Lucille Ball, believe it or not, is involved in the story. He pitches it to somebody, I can't remember, it may have been Herbert Solo, his agent. It's typical television production. They have to pitch to the next guy up, and they have to pitch to this studio and so forth. So somebody's explaining it to Lucille Ball, and she hears Star Trek, and she hears Star, and she thinks it's like celebrities, and then she becomes a good voice. Like she likes this show, a show about a ship at sea that goes to new ports and has famous celebrities making appearances on it, and a cruise ship. And it's not, something got lost in translation. But anyway, when Lucille Ball found out what it really was, she was still an advocate for it. And she happened to be head of Desilu Studios. And so, and she's now getting, in the past few decades, she's gotten credit for developing what mainstream sitcoms look like, having a 3-camera system and doing it live in front of an audience and all that. So she becomes an advocate, and then they pitch it to NBC, and NBC is given a bunch of story ideas, and they have to choose which one they want to invest money in. There's one about a kid who is picked up, and then he actually secretly, unbeknownst to the rest of the crew, he has powers that he had picked up from being an orphan on a planet, and he can't deal. He's just 15, and he has these enormous powers, and he can't deal. He has to learn to control himself. There's that idea. There's an idea about them going to a planet. The Star Trek wound up doing a number of these ones where they would beam down to a planet, and it's modeled after something in Earth history, or usually U.S. history. They beam down to a planet, and they find that there are the Yangs and the Combs. You find out that the Yangs are short for Yankees, and the Combs are short for communists, and it's a whole thing about that. And there's another one that's about the captain being kidnapped and by these aliens on this planet, and these aliens have had a nuclear war thousands of centuries ago, and they need him to literally mate with this female human who's also crashed some years, 18 years earlier, and they need to have them mate. It's kind of like a zoo kind of environment or situation, and in order to condition him mentally to stay there and repopulate the surface of the planet and make it more livable again, they put him through illusions. They found that their physical bodies were limited, and they developed their mental powers to such a degree that they can make someone think he's seeing something. Basically, make someone hallucinate so believably that the person hallucinating wouldn't be able to tell what's real and what's illusionary. So they put the captain through this. So those were some of the premises that NBC, were pitched to NBC, and essentially, as I recall, NBC said, "We like this one." It was called The Cage originally. It was called The Cage, and then so they invest money into it, and as usual, if I recall correctly, they get a little antsy, like, "Oh boy, this is an expensive budget here. Oh boy." And from what I've read in another book about, I think it's called The Real Star Trek, something like that, they were also questioning, oh boy, Gene Roddenberry has had a history of like creating a role for his girlfriend and being a little bit of a playboy, I'll just say. So they were a little iffy on that, from what I've read, and the budget for a science fiction show on a weekly basis was a little worrisome. But they went along anyway, and I wouldn't be surprised if the budget went over, the production went over budget. But they produced the episode, and there's been speculation, okay, I'll jump ahead a little bit. This episode was called The Cage, and then during production of it, they changed the name. It kind of alternated, or they changed the name to The Menagerie. And so 20 years later, it finally becomes released on home video for the first time for fans to see. And there's a little introduction where Gene Roddenberry talks to you, the viewer, of this VHS video cassette, introducing The Cage. And he explains that there were some changes that needed to be made. First of all, he had his girlfriend, later wife, a part written for her to be first officer. And she was supposed to be efficient and logical. And she had some aspects of what we would soon see in Spock. At some point, one of the photographs, she even had eyebrows that went up, and she was very efficient. She was she was the captain's right-hand woman. And in this introduction to the video cassette, he said that they didn't think that, or it was given to test audiences, and that the women in the test audiences couldn't believe that a woman would be in that high a position of authority. I think that's worthy of debate, whether he was exaggerating or not, because Gene Roddenberry, as it's been coming out, had his own take on certain experiences which weren't exactly accurate, or weren't actually as he exaggerated them to be. So there was that thing about you couldn't have a woman believably being second in command of a starship. And then I think from that book that I'd read, The Real Star Trek, I believe it's called, it was more that they were concerned about him in terms of relationships with women and actresses. They were concerned. They weren't saying no, beware, but they were saying, let's be cautious about this guy because he's had a reputation, womanizing, or touchy reputation in the past. Please read. This is from what, as I recall reading. I don't want to cast incorrect aspersions upon Gene Roddenberry, but from what I recall, this is my impression, pretty clear impression of it. So the other thing was that the budget was high, and the thing that he also mentioned in his intro to The Cage was that what he had pitched to them originally was this wagon train to the stars, and it was going to be gun battles and so forth, and action, adventure, And what he gave them was this thing where the mind goes in certain ways and speculation, philosophical debate, and what they wanted was a good Western set in outer space with ray guns and so forth. I think that was him talking and exaggerating, and perhaps, over time you start talking and talking, and then you start changing what really happened. Perhaps even unconsciously, you just start changing the story of what really happened, and create a drama out of it. Anyway, that's the way he told it, and that they just wanted a gunfight and so forth. That's the way he told it in the intro to this episode called The Cage. The video cassette release of The Cage 20 something years later. At the time, I think the fact that it was a costly thing to produce, I think his background in terms of being a playboy was something of concern to them, and so forth. But they decided, okay, we'll go ahead. You made this pilot. We don't like this. We suggest that you change some things around. We like the captain. We think that the rest of the crew should be changed, and especially this one guy that has pointed ears and eyebrows, upswept eyebrows, the alien, Spock. Okay, this is me interpreting what was going on. I think it's credible that they were concerned about affiliates in the South. They were concerned about how this Spock with the pointed ears, like satanic kind of look, quote satanic look, would look in certain affiliates or come across. They didn't want anything that would screw up the look of, they didn't want anything that would intimidate people away from trying the show out or watching the show. That's credible. I could see that. So Gene Roddenberry has said that he insisted, no, I want to keep Spock there. So the rest of the cast was largely changed, taken out, and Jeffrey Hunter, from what I've read, Jeffrey Hunter was already a big star, movie star, and the wife had misgivings. Again, these stories could have been twisted in certain ways. Please check out, but this is the common story that's told. Jeffrey Hunter's wife didn't want him in television, particularly in science fiction, because he was a big star and his reputation as an actor. So he was out. So they changed the cast. Basically, I won't belabor the point. They changed the cast, and so they produced a second TV pilot. Now this was unusual. I won't say it was even rare. I mean, it was uncommon to do. But Desilu had produced a second pilot in order to sell a show before, and in fact, even at the time, they were producing an alternate pilot because the first one failed. So they produced this next one, and there were certain stipulations, as I understand, that, okay, it better have a fist fight, it better have a gun battle, it better have a focus on action, and so forth, which was more common to Westerns at the time. And so this next one, was called Where No Man Has Gone Before, and they liked that one. William Shatner was cast as Captain Kirk in this one, and Leonard Nimoy remained as Spock, and the rest of the cast was all different. But it was still the Enterprise. Now, let me mention here. This would be a good point to mention. I should mention also that one of the premises that was given in that original pitch. Remember, NBC was trying to pick which pilot to go ahead and produce. There was one I described, The Cage, and I think Where No Man Has Gone Before is probably in there too. And then Charlie X I mentioned. There was another one that I forgot about. The Omega Glory was another one. There was another one I forgot about. It was Mud's Women. That was one where this character is beamed aboard. He's basically a space pimp. He has 3 women, and he's paid to find the husbands for them. He's trying to. He's a pimp. He's trying to. His destination is a certain planet, and he has these 3 women as cargo to go and get paid for finding these I don't know what the inhabitants, these buyers on this planet, wives. And he gets stuck, and there's a whole episode there. And I believe it was in the Star Trek The Compendium where it mentioned it's understandable that NBC didn't decide to go with Mudd's women because the idea of pimping in space, and there was a whole drug angle, like it was speaking against the use of drugs to make you feel better, but still they just didn't want to tackle that, so that's why one of the reasons they narrowed it down, they went with the cage. So this one they produced Where No Man Has Gone Before. It was much better received, and then they produced almost okay. There's a YouTube channel creator on YouTube, of course, who put it in an interesting way that I hadn't really thought I had an inkling about it this way, but he characterized that first episode of the series itself. You know, they produced 2 pilots, and then this is the 3rd one produced, and so technically this is the first episode of the series itself to be produced. It was called the Corbomite Maneuver. If you want to check on his channel, it's Captain Bob April. And I want to make sure I got that right because he subscribed to my channel, and I want to be respectful. But anyway, he characterized it as kind of like a 3rd pilot. And it's interesting because before I saw him say that, I noticed it was pretty evident in that episode. They were doing certain camera angles, and they were establishing certain characters who weren't in either of the previous 2 pilots. It was sort of like this is in some sense a new pilot, and the premise of the episode was about directly exploring space and the fear of the unknown. It was directly about fear of the unknown. So so let me tell you about the premise of the show itself, what I haven't told you already. It's Earth. It takes place in the future. Some references in the show. Sorry if you hear that in the background. I'm in an apartment building here. It's a little distracting. All right. So it's more of a united Earth. There are nations working together, and it's in the earlier episodes, it's simply a starship called the Enterprise. And Enterprise is an interesting word because it's something that's venturesome. It's like when you start a new venture, it's like you're starting a new enterprise, or you're very enterprising. You're very open to new ideas and adventurous. So the Enterprise, and it's representing Earth's interests, like a Navy ship would be representing U.S. interests. Its assignment, as described in the pitch, remember that Bible that I had mentioned earlier, is outlined as exploring new phenomena, like things previously unknown, basically exploring new scientific discoveries, defending outposts and colonies. In other words, Earth has colonized other planets, and something like the Navy, it also has there are naval bases in other countries. Well, in Star Trek, there are star bases. There are bases with cafeterias and restaurants. And you can imagine like a small town, something like the size of a small town. They have naval facilities and so forth. Well, here it's on a planet, various planets, and there would be bases of operations on these various planets. And It's to explore space and new frontiers and gain scientific knowledge for the benefit of Earth. It's to protect star bases and Earth colonies. And thinking there's a third thing, it basically it comes down to that. It's defending Earth interests, including outposts and colonies, and its people there, and it's exploring outer space. So that's a show. All right, so going to the history, goes through 3 seasons. It's in danger of being canceled at various times, at least a couple times, but it does last for 3 seasons and ends in June 1969, and then he goes off to, Gene Roddenberry goes off to do other things. He creates other pilots for TV shows, but of course nothing as tied with him as Star Trek is. And then Filmation, the company that did various cartoons, famous cartoons that you've seen, I'm sure He-Man and Masters of the Universe and other ones. Well, before that, they were still doing animation before He-Man. They would do some animations based on TV things, TV properties. And so they wanted to adapt Star Trek, have an animated version of Star Trek. And so Gene Roddenberry, of course, I mean, Star Trek is his baby. And perhaps out of a sense that the other stuff, his other projects weren't going as successfully as Star Trek, perhaps that implored him to be very protective of Star Trek. I'm speculating here, but now again, this is one of those moments when it's like you're depending on the storyteller telling you what happened. So, but the story that's been told is that they were going to have cadets being the main characters in this animated show, and whoever wrote it didn't seem to be familiar with the original series, and if this is true, Gene Roddenberry would have read that and thought, what are they doing to my show? So they got rid of that, and they just simply produced episodes as modeled after the original series. In other words, we have the same crew. For the most part, they could not afford Chekhov, the actor playing Chekhov, and they could not. There was somebody else, I think. There were 2 voice actors that weren't in there, or at least I think it was the one who played Chekhov in the TV series they couldn't afford. But thanks to Leonard Nimoy speaking up and saying, "Look, if you don't hire these other cast members from our original series to do their voices for their characters that fans have likened to and recognized, then I'm not going to be a part of this show either." So that got them back, and fortunately Leonard Nimoy spoke up. So they produced about 21 episodes. They were like the original series, only you didn't have like 51 minutes to tell a story. You had like 22 minutes to tell a story. And they could, since they were drawing it, they didn't have to spend thousands of dollars on big sets and large costumes and so forth. They could draw whatever they wanted to. So these episodes tended to be very imaginative, very what if, like huge. Like in one episode, they have a giant Spock turn up. Fantastic ideas. And then that ends for whatever reason. I can't remember at the moment. And then Gene Roddenberry, somewhere along the line, Gene Roddenberry was still interested in getting a new series, a new incarnation of the show back on the air, because it seemed very noticeable that this show was getting ratings. I mean, it was performing well in the ratings, even though it wasn't even in current production. It was syndicated to various affiliate stations, and it was still there was definitely a market out there to put the show back into production, back on the air. So they called it Star Trek Phase 2, and so now the premise was that Admiral Captain Kirk is now promoted to Admiral. I don't know why he wasn't Commodore in there somewhere, but anyway, he's Admiral Kirk, and he assembles the original crew back. And the one that they couldn't get back was Leonard Nimoy, because he had wanted to, I don't want to say he wanted to divorce himself, but I'll just keep it simple that it seems pretty clear. He wanted to go on to other projects and explore other things as an actor. And about that same time, we're talking the late 70s into the early 80s, he had been a host on a TV show about the paranormal called In Search Of, which is an interesting show. It's half an hour. Each episode is devoted to things like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, what happened to JFK. I don't know if there was one, what happened to JFK, but what happened to such and such in the Garden of Eden, and mysteries and paranormal. All right, ghosts and haunted houses and so forth. So he hosted the show. So there was also an issue about, this is a big stickler for him as it's come out. They were holding back on his, first of all, payment. I'll get into that. I think he wasn't getting all of his fan mail. That was an issue, I think, with a number of people, that they weren't getting all their fan mail. Somewhere the fan mail was getting lost in transition. But Star Trek, NBC and whatever other companies were associated, was making bank, so to speak, on Spock. And Leonard Nimoy was saying, look, I acted this part. That's essentially what your cartoon depictions and whatever, that's me in costume. And I'm not getting a penny off of this. So there's this, essentially legal dispute. I'm not coming back to Star Trek until you pay me for all those royalties off of this thing. You're clearly making money off of this, and I played a part in the role. So for Star Trek Phase 2, they were going to have a different Vulcan. This time, it was going to be a full Vulcan. Spock was half Vulcan, half human because of his parentage, and this one would be Xon, X-O-N, would be fully Vulcan, but he recognized the value of Spock exploring or being in contact with human emotions. So contrary to that, he was open and curious about humanity and human emotions. So they wrote that as his character. And there was another character, Ilea, was a Deltan from some number Delta, and then the fourth planet around that star, 114 Delta 4 or something or other. Fourth planet orbiting that star. And she could read minds, and she was bald, and played by Persis Khambatta, who was a model in India. I believe it's India. So she was brought on board, and they were constructing sets. And then, I'll speed this up. They were constructing sets, and it was about mid to late 70s, and then Star Wars came out in 1977, and wow, that's a pretty good hit for a science fiction fantasy film. And then Close Encounters of the Third Kind comes out, and I think that was 1978, and that's a big hit as well. And it seems that science fiction is becoming marketable. So, they decided, so we want to produce a fourth network aside from ABC, NBC, and CBS. It's going to be the new Paramount network, and we're going to produce this as a two-part movie called In Thy Image, Star Trek Phase 2. It's going to be premiering on television as a two-part movie, or a full-length movie, made-for-TV movie called In Thy Image, and then their episode summaries. I'm not sure if they went into full episode scripting or not, how far that went, but they had a whole lineup for the first half, like 13 episodes plotted out. And then, wait a minute, no, let's go to make a movie out of it, a feature film movie out of it. And I think they went back and forth. That's been described that way, and went back and forth. And then finally, okay, all right, Close Encounters, and Star Wars, and I don't know what other movies were really big. Okay, let's make a feature film, Paramount feature film. And so, meanwhile, by the way, I should mention a little tidbit. Paramount in the third season, Paramount, I believe, bought out Desi Liu that was producing the show. So that's why Paramount was involved in the first place. So they're going to make a movie called Star Trek, the motion picture. You know, like now we have, well, for a while we would have shows based on TV shows, movies based on TV shows. Like you'd have Transformers, the movie, and you'd have He-Man, the movie, and I don't know, She-Ra, the movie, and whatever, something, the movie. Even X-Files, a TV show, and then they made a movie too, although it was called Fight the Future. But anyway, people think of it as X-Files, the movie. So they essentially take a lot of the elements from this Phase 2 idea that had already been developed. They already had the sets constructed, and they make a movie out of it. And they have a first officer, Will Decker, and they put in that character, Ilea, and they have Zahn is a character, but he gets killed off, and then Spock, Leonard Nimoy, was able to get those darn budget, those darn royalty negotiations hammered out. And he came back, and Leonard Nimoy came back, so Spock is back, and they produced the motion picture. And that was released December 7th, 1979, and great. Wow. Okay, this is 10 years after the original series had been off the air, and it was running in reruns constantly, and there were Star Trek conventions put on by fans, which had developed a whole world and routine and understanding and way of operations wholly unto themselves, putting on these fan conventions. And there were action figures put out and so forth. So they have the motion picture, and fans probably went in droves. I mean, what else? What other Star Trek thing would they? Let me rephrase that. If you're a fan of something for 10 years and a movie comes out, by golly, you're probably going to go to it. So, the ratings were really good. The outpouring was really good. So they decide to make another movie. However, there were criticisms. I'm not sure if the criticisms came later, but I wouldn't be surprised if they came at the time. I should mention that when the motion picture came out, the actual production was so rushed that they couldn't adequately edit it down and pick up the pacing, take out certain scenes. When you produce there's like a rough cut or a first cut, you have a lot of your material in that first cut of your movie, and then it takes a director, it takes editing, it's a whole procedure to cut it down and then tweak things. They didn't have time for that. They just rushed it out. And in fact, I remember somewhere in some documentary, while it was, before it was sent to theaters, and in the midst of that, they were getting like the final reel of the film still wet, just before, literally like within hours before it was set to be shown in the theaters. So that's how rushed the thing was. So it was. I wouldn't be surprised if these complaints about it being slow and awkward at points were complaints at the time, but still there was enough fandom, there was enough showing. This is successful. Let's make another movie. We're going to make The Wrath of Khan, and then they brought in somebody else named Harve Bennett, and they brought in somebody named Nicholas Meyer. They had several different plot ideas for the second movie. And so there were interesting things about these various ideas or drafts. And Nicholas Meyer had not seen the original series. And I don't want to confuse this with Harve Bennett. It may have been Harve Bennett who watched the original series. And when Nicholas Meyer or Harve Bennett came upon an episode called Space Seed, and this character named Khan. The way the episode ended inspired him to think of a what if we were to discover him again. What has happened since that episode. So I believe it was Harv Bennett that had that experience. Anyway, there were several different ideas, and Nicholas Meyer had not seen the original series, but he was familiar with naval tradition, and he liked the character in the Horatio Hornblower novels. Who is Horatio Hornblower? I forget exactly when. I want to say the 19th century, but there's a series of novels fictional novels about an English captain or commander of a ship called Horatio Hornblower. I think he was captain too. Yeah, Captain Horatio Hornblower. And it turns out, I think unbeknownst to him, Gene Roddenberry also was inspired partially by Horatio Hornblower, and modeled Captain Kirk somewhat after this character in literature. So Nicholas Meyer takes all these aspects, what was good, or what seemed to work from all these different drafts, or I don't even want to say drafts, these different scripts, and merges them together. And sometimes when you do that, you get a camel or you get muck, but actually he took the best themes, and I guess he had really good, talented expertise in doing it. He wrote an action-oriented script, whereas the first movie was very much, in some sense, let me figure out how to say this. The original series, like I said before, remember the Enterprise had two different missions. Mission one, one part of its mission was to defend Earth outposts and colonies and defend Earth interests. And then the other aspect was exploring new phenomena. And so the first movie focused more on the exploring new phenomena, whereas the second movie it's more like space. And there was a movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had come out, I think 1968 or 69. I think it was 1968. It was more in that venue of the sounds of space, like the experience of traveling through space. It was more like that. And in The Wrath of Khan, it was an action-adventure story, which is what you see typically in the original series. I think more episodes are action-adventure rather than simply exploring space. So he combined that with the naval parallel, paradigm that he saw, he was familiar with, and he just wrote a dynamite story. And so they, as I understand it, they figured, okay, this is a good sequel to the motion picture. And so Leonard Nimoy was curious about leaving the Spock character behind. I don't want to say curious, just he figured, okay, we're going to leave the Spock character behind. This may be the final movie, sequel movie. How many movies does a franchise typically have? So he was going to, well, I don't want to give away any spoilers. There's a pivotal thing with him in it, in the climax. And so the ball starts rolling, the thought process starts rolling. Well, if this is successful, we're going to have another movie. So they inserted little bits that were things to play off from or continue if there is a third movie. And sure enough, it was a success. It was enough of a success that they. And also in terms of the budget, I'll just mention that in terms of the budget, it was kept short because they used some footage and sets. They already had the sets constructed from the first movie, so it was a clever work of what had happened before. So they didn't have to. So the budget wasn't as big. It didn't cost as much to make the sequel. So then they make the third movie, playing off of the stuff that they had set up in the second movie, the search for Spock. Third movie. and that was a big success. And then and then the fourth movie, and so forth and so on. So okay, so that's the original crew, and then that's 1986, and then Gene Roddenberry. Meanwhile, as I understand it, had been away. I mean, it was credited, based on the series created by Gene Roddenberry, but Harv Bennett and others and Paramount Studio had basically stepped in and produced these movies. So Gene Roddenberry was still going to these conventions and still saying, "This is my baby. I created Star Trek." He was very much involved in Star Trek and fandom and so forth. And so he wanted to come back and produce sorry, I keep looking at here. Let me move this. Let me just put this to the bottom of the screen. Okay, I'm looking straight at you. Okay, sorry about that. So Gene Roddenberry wanted to come back and produce a series like the original series, and he saw this as an opportunity based on what he's written and the new Bible and so forth. He saw this as a new opportunity to do things that weren't allowed, things that you couldn't talk about in the original series. There's something that I neglected to mention, that he used this science fiction show in the original series and then ongoing, like every incarnation of Star Trek has followed this. It's a means of commenting on contemporary issues, but not being so heavy-handed with it. Like when you watch a TV show, and particularly in the 1980s or something, and there's a situation about homelessness or drug addiction or racism or whatever, you can be heavy-handed about it, and in such a way sometimes that it might turn viewers off, like, oh, it's be preachy, and I don't want to watch a story about racism or drug addiction or something. I want to relax and enjoy for an hour. And so what Gene Roddenberry did was simply have a planet depicting, like, one race on the planet is black on the right side and white on the left, and then they're enslaving, or they have enslaved another group of people that's black on the left side and white on the right side, and so the Enterprise explores and gets entangled in a mess related to that. And the audience, as Gene Roddenberry pointed out in one of his series Bibles, the audience is intelligent. There's actually a mind out there watching, and they can pick up on the fact that this is commenting on racism and comments about nuclear war. In fact, there was an episode in the original series called A Private Little War. And keep in mind, this was like 1967 or 68. It was in the second season. So 66 and 7. Yeah, it was either 67 or 68. Where they through some incident, they become entangled in this planet's society. They discover that the Klingons, they had been peaceful, and they just peaceful, let alone to themselves, like a Garden of Eden. And then the Klingons, who are like these enemy forces that the Federation, the Earth, finds itself entangled with. The enemy Klingons have been promoting one of the leaders of this planet, one of the inhabitants of this planet, and boosting him up as the next leader, so that he will be a governor, so that the Klingons really want this planet for their own. Whereas what should be done is that the planet should be just kept to itself, alone, at peace, and not aligned with either the Earth or the Klingons. And so this has screwed it up. Now you've got a Klingon ship on behalf of the Klingon Empire, boosting up one of the citizens, giving him weaponry, teaching him how to fire weapons. And it's like the serpent in Garden of Eden. In fact, they referenced it as the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And now the Enterprise gets entangled, and there's an interesting debate between Captain Kirk and the Doctor, Mr. Spock, the Doctor. I'm sorry, Dr. McCoy, where Dr. McCoy says, in so many words, it's not enough that one group has to be involved in this. You're gonna and potentially die and lead miserable lives. You've got to make sure that the whole planet is engulfed in this conflict. And then Kirk says, "Do you remember those brush fire wars in the late 20th century?" And McCoy, now keep in mind, this is 1967, 68, something like that. Vietnam had been there. It was before a lot of the protest had really kicked in. Anti-Vietnam sentiment really kicked in. I wasn't alive at the time, but it was either at the time of the protest or just before the protest. And you couldn't really show this on television, is my understanding. McCoy says, "Yes, I remember. It went on bloody year after bloody year." And Kirk says, "Well, the only solution was to arm both sides so that neither one could have an advantage over the other and wipe the other one out. It's like a balance of terror," which, by the way, was an episode title of an earlier Star Trek episode, unrelated to this, but it was interesting. Balance of power. It's a better, accurate term, balance of power. So that's, in some way, how Star Trek is worthwhile to watch, because it makes you think, and it makes you speculate, and just be more curious about what's going on around you, and how Star Trek comments on the human condition, and society, and politics, and so, like, a few people have joked that, in the past few years or something, I've heard that Star Trek was actually woke way back in the 1960s. There's this wokeism and preachiness now. Star Trek was like that way back. All right, so where was I going with this? So, so Gene Roddenberry in 1986, something like that, wanted to go back and discuss things that you couldn't discuss even in 1960s television. And he was very big on commenting on our concepts of God. My understanding is that he was an atheist. And not only God, but like sex and drugs and who knows what, lots of different concepts. So so they were eager to produce this new show, and he became, I think he was executive producer. He got back into the center seat, and he started calling the shots. And that's when his secretary in the original show, in the original show, he had a secretary, Dorothy Fontana, and she proved herself so well in script writing and story ideas that she was promoted during the series, early on during the series. There's only 3 seasons of the series, but quickly became promoted to the point of writing episodes, and also, I believe, rewriting episodes, improving episodes, whatever that means, but basically moving them toward production quality. And so in this new show, Star Trek The Next Generation, you had David Gerrold, who was remained active as, if nothing else, a Star Trek fan. And as I said before, published books about Star Trek. And you had D.C. Fontana, and those two came in, and they largely worked on, and probably also, in league with Gene Roddenberry, they produced the pilot episode and the Bible, the series Bible for the series. And I'll spare you, there was some intrigue with, people being promoted, people leaving the show, and over the course of the show, things changed and so forth. And Gene Roddenberry died in the 5th season of Next Generation. But anyway, it lasted 7 years, and it took place about 100 years after the original series. And in about the 5th season or 6th season, I think it was the 6th season, you had a spin-off show called Deep Space Nine, and that took place concurrently with the Next Generation. So you had the Next Generation, you had the Enterprise still going on its mission, and then you had formerly a space station from that of some aliens that, and now the Federation of Planets has taken over and they're running that space station, and that's called Deep Space Nine, and that's more like an internal situation where you have, it's more focused on ongoing plot lines and ongoing storylines, and whereas the original series and the Next Generation was very interchangeable in terms of episode order, and I'll get into episode order in a little while, but you could, it wasn't that important the order in which you watch the episodes. But in Deep Space Nine, they began to do more story arcs, and it was gearing up. It was about the time you had the X-Files new to television, and that had a clear story arc, certain episodes in certain orders, in a certain order. And now, of course, we have very serialized things where I'm watching TV series now. I'm watching YouTube reactions and commentary from people younger than me, new viewers, and talking about TV series, and they talk about like ongoing plot lines, and it's very serialized storytelling, which you didn't have, really until maybe the 1990s for the most part on television. So you have Deep Space Nine and Star Trek, two separate shows running concurrently, and then Star Trek Next Generation ends in spring of 1994, and Deep Space Nine continues, and then shortly afterwards, oh, by the way, they've had, the original cast has come out with Star Trek V, The Final Frontier in 1989, and then 1991 was the final movie starring the original cast in that Star Trek, was this The Undiscovered Country. All right, so, and that comes out while The Next Generation is still airing, and then Deep Space Nine after that. So, so you have Deep Space Nine, Star Trek, and then Star Trek ends, Deep Space Nine continues, and then shortly afterward you have on a new Paramount network, yes, they finally got a new Paramount network, you have Star Trek Voyager premiering, essentially taking the place of Star Trek The Next Generation, and set on a different starship called the Voyager, and a similar setup. And so those run, and Deep Space Nine ends, and Voyager continues, and all right, so skipping ahead, Voyager ends after 7 seasons as well. I think Deep Space Nine had 7 seasons, Star Trek The Next Generation had 7 seasons, and then I think Voyager probably had 7 seasons. And then some time goes by, and then 2001 or 2002, I think 2001, Enterprise comes out, and it's set about 100 years, maybe 150 years before, is 100 years before the original series. So if you're watching it chronologically, it would be Enterprise, and then, which is essentially the prequel series, a different ship named Enterprise, and then you have the original series, and then you have the movies, and then the Next Generation, if you're watching in chronological order. All right, so, and on, and Enterprise lasts only 4 seasons, and then I won't go any further because that gives you a good grounding right there. I want to talk about some certain aspects you want to understand to help you understand the show if you're going into it for the first time. All right, let me cut this now, and I'll be right. Okay, so let me explain the universe of Star Trek to give you a good foundation. I suggest watching the original series in the 1960s or the Next Generation. Those two seem simple enough to start watching, getting into Star Trek. If you want to get into Star Trek, start with the 60s show or the Next Generation. Like I said before, and these things in the original series, it wasn't all planned out. It started off as just Earth, and then you had the Enterprise and some references to other starships. But over time, quickly during that first season especially, they started establishing certain things. They started establishing what the universe was, like what they started filling in details and establishing things. Okay, so let me explain the universe as it's pretty much established in the original series. You have Earth, which is pretty well united, called United Earth, and then there's a spacefaring version of that, like the U.S. has its Navy. You have Starfleet, and there's been a question whether Starfleet is part of the United Federation of Planets or whether it's just a force, a fleet from Earth. If you actually pay attention to the series, I think it's pretty clear. It's, especially the original series, it's clearly a force from Earth. But it kind of later on, like third season, it gets mangled to appear as part of the Federation of Planets. Okay, so what's the United Federation of Planets? That came a little bit later. If you think about the United Nations, you have the Earth, and you have members of the United Nations who agree to be members, and they abide by a certain constitution. Well, the same way in here, you have Earth, like the United States, you have Earth as a member of these united, this Federation of United Planets. And Vulcan is one of them, and you have other planets. So Starfleet acts in the best interests of the United Federation of Planets and members of the United Federation of Planets. Often you see the Enterprise going to answer distress call or answer some kind of, responding to some distress from a planet that is a member of the Federation. So there's some linkage there. It has some loyalty to these members of the Federation. All right, so the Enterprise itself, it's a starship like a naval cruiser or naval ship. It has there are Starfleet ranks. So these ranks don't just refer to characters on the Enterprise. They are like the Navy. They are ranks in general. You start off as a cadet and then a midshipman during the Starfleet Academy, and then after you graduate Starfleet Academy, you go on to be assigned to hopefully a starship or some kind of ship. A starship in the series is described as being more of an elite class of assignment. You could be assigned to a cargo ship or a scout ship or something. But if you score high grades in the academy and you do really well, you may be assigned to a starship, which is like an elite assignment. So the ranks are ensign, and then ensign, lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant commander, commander, captain, and by the time you're maybe lieutenant commander, but if you're commander, especially if you're captain, chances are you're commanding a ship of your own. And then after that, there's commodore, which is a commander over a fleet of ships. So whereas Captain Kirk is commander of the Enterprise, somebody like Commodore Decker would be commanding the Enterprise, the Intrepid, the Excalibur, the Hood, and so forth. So after Commodore, then you get to Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, and Admiral. In the original series and much of Star Trek as a whole, they don't reference Rear Admiral and Vice Admiral. Those, they've been mentioned sometimes, but those largely come from simply naval tradition. They're simply referred to as Admiral. And when you reach Admiral, you're definitely in Starfleet headquarters. You're way up there in terms of Starfleet Command. Now, what's Starfleet Command? It's like Naval Command, U.S. Navy. The headquarters is based on Earth, largely, and you have different departments and divisions that are overseeing the whole operations of Starfleet. And as my understanding, you have different admirals. It seemed like in the original series and in the Next Generation, you have different admirals acting at the same time. I'm not sure if it's that way in the Navy or not. I think so. You could have different admirals, not many admirals, because of course at that point promotion becomes rare. I suppose you just can't have that many cooks, and I guess you have many cooks in the kitchen. Okay, so I've explained the ranks. Oh, and also in the original series, you have the uniform colors mean something very, very specific. In the original series, look on their wrist. If they don't have any ribbons around the wrist, that makes them either a petty officer, which means, I think it means that they haven't gone into the Navy. I mean, haven't gone into Starfleet. Or warrant officer. I think warrant officer, they haven't gone. There's something about warrant officer has had some training, responsibilities, but they haven't gone into the academy, something like that. Check your Navy, look up in the Navy how this goes. But, okay, so if you don't have any ribbons, you're either an ensign or some kind of warrant officer or petty officer or something. And then if you have if you have dots instead of a ribbon, full solid ribbon around, that would be, I'm guessing that would be lieutenant junior grade. I've never seen a lieutenant junior grade in the original series, but it follows suit. Then the next one up, I have seen there's a full solid ribbon going around, and that indicates lieutenant. And then if you have a solid ribbon, and then above that you have dots going around, usually like 3 noticeable dots going around. That's lieutenant commander. And then there's a pattern here. And then if the solids are replaced by simply another solid line, a ribbon or line, meaning there are 2 lines around the wrist, then that means commander. And then you can probably predict after this, if there's a solid line going around and then dots and then another solid line, that means captain. And then Commodore gets a little fancier. You have a solid line and another solid line, and then in between you have some specially colored something between the 2 lines. That's Commodore, and I don't even know what Admiral is. You see them on view screens. You don't even really see their wrists all that often. So those are the ranks. The colors of the uniforms indicate the divisions, and this is not just on the Enterprise. This is just in Starfleet headquarters or Starbase headquarters or a Starbase office or something, just in general. You have 3 colors. You have red, yellow. Well, it's not. It comes across many times as yellow, and people call it yellow, but it's said that the uniform was more of a greenish color that looked yellowish on TV. You know, the way it was filmed, it came across yellow. And you have blue. Now they indicate different divisions or collections of departments. Blue was science. See how, very logical and systematic this is. Blue is science. Red is engineering and support services. And I'll just say yellow-green, I'll call it, is command and basic shipboard operations. It's interesting that in the first 2 pilots, the Cage and Where No Man Has Gone Before, there were really, I think, only 2 colors. There was like a yellowish color and there was a bluish color, which emphasizes more the combination of 2 different fields. There's the like Starfleet. There's the shipboard operations crew, and then there's the science, the sciencey crew, and the 2 are combined together. And then for the series, after those 2 pilots, for the course of the series, you have 3 colors. So they took like the ship, the running of the ship, the crew that runs the ship, they split them into like yellow, green, and red. So in addition to the color, you also have, I believe it's on this, the left side of the shirt, you have either a spiral, you have some symbol. First of all, you have what's on the Enterprise crew like an arrowhead shape. And it's clear to me that, based on other symbols being seen by other characters on other ships and on other assignments, that this arrow seems to just indicate that you're a member of the Enterprise crew. Excuse me. There are other ones that show like a star pattern, like a pointed circle around it, and that's on a different ship or a different assignment, so forth. It seems clear that it's just the Enterprise crew. Within that, you have either a spiral or what looks like an oval with a smaller oval within it. That is sciences. So of course, if you have a blue uniform, expect to see that oval and then a smaller oval within that. And then you have like a C, like a symbol like that. And that is, if I remember correctly, that's on the yellow-green uniforms or the red uniforms. I can't remember actually what's on the red. One of them has that. It's weird as a Star Trek fan to forget about that, but it's been a long time since I even paid attention to that. So anyway, what I'm saying is it's pretty consistent. You have one that's like this, and that's only on one color of uniform, and then you have the sciences emblem, which is like that, and it always goes on a blue uniform. Let me talk about not really the characters, but the positions. You have a commanding officer, and then you have a science officer who obviously gives information science-related to the captain, and that's Mr. Spock's role. And then you have a navigator and a helmsman. The navigator, and they sit side by side, obviously. The navigator plots the course, and the helmsman steers the ship. And that the helmsman is Sulu, the Asian, and Chekhov, or some other stand-in character when Chekhov isn't there, is the navigator. And then you have Uhura, who is the communications officer, who, she sends out messages. Sometimes Kirk will say, send a message to such and such. She will initiate, she's like operating the radio, the ship's radio. And the character, Uhura herself, I'm not sure if she's actually described in the original series, but since then, in novels and in the newer JJ Abrams movies, she's described, she's portrayed as something of a linguist. I know in the original series, she likes to sing. So she wears a red uniform. I think she should be wearing a yellow uniform. It depends whether communications is more of an operations or more of an engineering type thing. Anyway, I think she should be wearing yellow, but maybe she looks better in red. Then there's a whole engineering department, and that also wears red, and that's headed up by Scotty, who has a Scottish accent, and his job is to make sure that the Enterprise is running well, and the Enterprise is like his baby, and he wants to make sure it's safe and sound, and that's his top priority. And if there's a repair or something, he'll complain that it takes such and such number of hours or weeks to repair it, and he makes sure that the ship is running smoothly, physically running smoothly. And he's very energetic, he's dynamic, and enthusiastic, and so forth. And so he's wearing red because he's part of the engineering and support services. Now, you've probably heard about red shirts being killed off. Actually, I read somewhere that actually yellow shirts tend to be killed off more often, but the red shirts got that stigma anyway, because there's a security force on the Enterprise, and they're the police officers, and they're the police officers and the guards. And so when you have a crew beaming down to a planet, you see Kirk, Spock, and Ensign Gomez in a red uniform, guess who's going to be shot and killed? You may not go back with them. You know, we have star number one. We have William Shatner as Kirk. We have Leonard Nimoy as Spock, and we have some guy we've never seen before beaming down in a red shirt. Guess what's going to happen? So his chances are he's going to be the security officer. So that's where that came about. And incidentally, in the Next Generation, I think I can jump, really. In the first motion picture, the color of the uniforms all changed. I don't know if there's any systematic understanding behind the uniforms for the first motion picture, but or the movies. In the Next Generation, they kept that same three-color thing, only they called it teal, mustard, and wine or red. And so, for whatever reason, it's been described one way as they didn't want the stigma of the red shirt to carry on into this new Next Generation. So they switched, and I've also explained it, I've heard it explained as the actor playing the new captain on the Next Generation looked better in red. Okay, so for whatever reason, they switched yellow and red. All right, jumping back to the original series. So yeah, those three colors. You have those operations. You have a yeoman. Now, a yeoman, the term yeoman comes from actual naval parlance. Yeoman, if I understand correctly, is essentially a clerk. He handles clerical duties and so forth. I can only speculate at this point, but I'm guessing that since Gene Roddenberry was involved in the original series, and he had something of a playboy instinct, and of course television being what it is, you needed a woman in there somewhere, and especially in the thinking at the time, I can guess that when you think yeoman and you have these very active male characters, a clerk might be a woman character. That's only me speculating, but I mean, thinking that might have been how it came out. But anyway, you have a character introduced in the series, in the Corbomite Maneuver onward, not in the two pilots, but in the series, called Yeoman Janice Rand, and she played by Grace Lee Whitney, and she starts off in the Corbomite Maneuver and then lasts for a few episodes, and then for whatever reason there's been talk about why she was dropped from the series, but for whatever reason she's no longer there for the rest of the series. I should mention actually that there are three different ways, well, two primary ways. You can watch them in Stardate order, but that's kind of pointless. It's kind of academic, but there are two principal ways in which you should watch the show. You could watch the show. You can watch it in air date order, or you can watch it in production order. If you're new to the show, I think it would make more sense if you watched it the way I did when I was watching these in syndication. They would run them in production order. Now, I'll go to that in a moment, but let me finish off Janice Rand. So the role of a yeoman, as I said, in the Navy is simply like a clerk or somebody who provides equipment, or I'm not sure, he wouldn't be providing equipment, basically a clerk. And then there's other background characters that have appeared in the show in various episodes. You have a records officer, a personnel officer. You have characters that you would see, their uniform looks different. By the way, what I just said about the color of the uniforms and the design of the uniforms, those were the officers. Now, there are 428, it said at one point in Charlie X. There are 428 on the Enterprise. Now, these are officers and crew. The officers have gone through Starfleet Academy. So it's like them going to college. They've graduated and they're well educated. Like the Navy, you also have like petty officers and warrant officers who haven't, as I understand, have not gone through the academy. So they would be the crew. Uh, there are other there. So in addition to the uniforms that I mentioned, the colors, you also see these characters wearing jumpsuits with a longer collar and jumpsuits that look more like they are working on, like they're doing physical work. Those would be the crew, and the color system follows. You have blue and yellow, green, and you have red. Let me see. So those are clearly not the officers. All right, so I've basically explained the setup of that. I was going to talk about the production order. You have air date and production order date. Now, in the first season, NBC chose, out of several episodes already ready to be aired, it could have aired Where No Man Has Gone Before. It had other episodes, I think, that were already produced that could have been aired, but somebody at NBC decided to air The Man Trap as its first episode. This is an indication of how episodic, or how almost like an anthology series television typically was. The episodes were interchangeable. You could air this one ahead of this other one because there was no connection between the two timeline-wise. So they simply aired The Man Trap because it had a monster and it had a typical people being killed off mysteriously and a problem, mysteries to be solved, and it seemed easy, very relatable, I'm guessing, very relatable episode concept for a new audience. And then over time, some episodes were ready ahead of other episodes. There would be a phase of filming all the live action stuff, and then there's post-production where you would edit it together. Not only would you edit the clips together into the final episode, but you'd have to add in special effects and visual effects, and that could take some time. And then there were scripting delays and so forth. So through the natural course of the way production goes, the episodes are out of order, or were aired out of order from their production. So the actual, and you can see the list in production order. You can go online. You can go to you can go to Wikipedia and see list of Star Trek episodes, and you see the production order and the air date order. And you can see sometimes they're vastly different. So I think that if you're going into it new, especially in the first season, with these different changes, like Rand suddenly not being in the show anymore, and costume changes, and especially early on cast changes and so forth, and set design changes, it's easier, it's more understandable if you watch it in production order. I'll reel off. I get into the around episode 20 something before I lose track of the exact episode order, but The Cage was the first pilot, and it was unaired. In fact, it was unaired until 1988, before the second season premiere of The Next Generation. And then Where No Man Has Gone Before, which is part of the series, although it was the second of the two pilots. And then Corporal Light Maneuvers 3, Mud to Women is 4, The Enemy Within is 5, Man Trap is 6, although that was the first episode aired. 7 is The Naked Time, 8 is Charlie X, 9 is Balance of Terror, 10 is Dagger of the Mind, 11 is What Are Little Girls Made Of? I'm still wondering what little girls are made of, but that's another story for another video. 12 is Miri, 13 is The Conscience of the King, 14 is The Galileo 7, 15 is Court Martial, 16 is a two-part episode, but I'll just call it 16. And the Star Trek Compendium that I had mentioned earlier helped me remember these numbers. That's how I remember these so well. 16 is the Menagerie, which took... I'll tell you a story about the Menagerie and the Court Martial, the one before it, number 15. they were at some point I think they didn't even have episodes ready yet. And Gene Roddenberry essentially said, well, we have this episode called The Cage, which changed its name to The Menagerie, that's just sitting here. It has a different cast of characters, but like we're down to the wire, and like we already have this episode that hasn't aired yet. So look, I'm going to write an episode, it's one of those episodes where you use footage from earlier on, but people, I think it's largely been abused, that technique of taking clips, what they call a clip show. It's been largely abused on television. Well, I don't want to say largely, but it has been abused on television. But here it was a very creative way of doing it. He wrote a whole episode. I think if you take out the scenes of the Menagerie, it could take up like a whole, 40 or 50 something minute episode all by itself. But what he did was create a scenario for this story, allowing for like almost all of the Cage, or the Menagerie, that pilot, to be inserted in. And there were some alterations. That's why there's that value, that specialness about seeing the original Cage pilot without being part of the Menagerie. Seeing that original Cage as it was meant to be seen. That's why in 1986, getting that video cassette with Gene Roddenberry's introduction was so nice and so valuable. You don't have to mess with the Menagerie. Just watch this as originally intended. So anyway, they had this courtroom set up for the Menagerie, two-parter, and then before that, so I think he wrote it. I remember a memo in the Making of Star Trek book, in which I think Gene Roddenberry mentioned he was writing an episode that would take place before and use some of the concepts of that trial that would occur in the Menagerie. But anyway, he writes, there's an episode called Court Martial. Before that, totally different plot, but it's the same trial idea. Maybe he was just simply inspired by the idea of the trial in the Menagerie, and he wrote an episode to go before it. But anyway, Court Martial was 15. Okay, then you have 16, and then the Menagerie, two-parter. And then 17 is the Galileo 7. 18, I believe, is Squire of Gothos. 18. 19, now I start trying to figure out which ones. I think 19 is motorcycle going by. 19, I think, is Space Seed, which is the one with Khan, where they discover Khan for the first time. And then that's a prequel in some sense. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is where we come across Khan again and find out what happened since the time between Space Seed and The Wrath of Khan. So it's been recommended that you see Space Seed first before the Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan movie. Then I think Tomorrow Was Yesterday, I think is 20. And then somewhere in there are other episodes. You can look it up, but that's the order from my memory. And I think that's about it. Let me check and I'll come back. Okay, great. Unless I come up with something else, I'm up to the point where I wanted to mention some episodes that I would recommend. Now, since I'm covering not only the original series, but also the Next Generation and so forth, I'll stop at the Next Generation. I have wrote down some recommended episodes. Now, feel free, as I said before, because these episodes are interchangeable, you don't have to watch it in a particular order. If you watch it in production order, it will make sense as the series changes over time in terms of producing it and setting up the universe. And if you watch it in air date order, you get the experience of having watched it in the 1960s, what would have been like. And I should also mention that if you really want to get the experience of what the series would have looked like, watching it in the 1960s, you should watch what they had. They would have a commercial, as sometimes done in especially dramatic television, even into the 80s. There would be a commercial. In Star Trek's case, it was called The Next Voyage. It would simply be a commercial summarizing some of what, teasing you about what the next week's episode would be about. So you'd have the regular episode as it plays out, and then it would show commonly a shot of the Enterprise maneuvering, and it would say, I think in white letters, "Next Voyage," and then it would show. Now, in the original series, in the original series version of that, there was no narrator. It simply had clips, and the clips together is like a montage. It essentially was a montage, and it gave you a taste of what the concept was for the following episode in a very dramatic way. And then after that, it would cut to the ending theme with the visuals and credits rolling. In the Next Generation, they did something similar to that, but they would have it would say Star Trek: The Next Generation, and it would fly. Those words would fly through in some fancy design logo, and then it would have a male narrator saying, "On the next episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Captain Picard faces the trial of his life." And then they show scenes. Like a montage of clips from the upcoming episode. Next time on Star Trek: The Next Generation. Then they would kick in with the ending theme song. So, okay, going back to my recommendation list, it doesn't necessarily matter which order, but these episodes I picked are ones, like here, the original series, are ones that are, I think, Star Trek at its best, and or show off some key thing about Star Trek that was introduced. Like, for example, the Romulans are first introduced in this episode, so it would be good to watch that episode to learn who the Romulans are. Watch this episode to learn, to watch the Klingons in their very first episode, and so forth. So some of these episodes introduce key things. Okay, Where No Man Has Gone Before, Balance of Terror is a very good story. People have likened it to the plot of a movie called The Enemy Below. I almost said The Enemy Within. That's another episode. The Enemy Below. It's very good political drama, and it comments on the entanglement and frustration of war and duty to government. The Menagerie, of course, I've explained, should be pretty obvious why I included that. It's because it shows parts of the cage. So you get 2 episodes in one. You see the Menagerie, plus you see this earlier most of this earlier pilot. Then there's the episode Space Seed, and these are all from the first season. Space Seed introduces Khan for the first time, so should you want to watch Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, or even in the JJ Abrams universe, those 3 movies, they introduce Khan, and it. First of all, let me go off on a tangent and go on. It was not a diatribe. Go on a rant, a little mini rant on JJ Abrams Star Trek. They're good in the sense that they introduced new viewers who, some of which have gone and watched the original show and have said, wow, this is better than I thought, and this is better than the J.J. Abrams movies. But there's that thing. They introduced perhaps a new group of fans or new population of fandom. 2, it's action-oriented. 3, there was some loyalty, there was some dedication or decent portrayal, an effort at decent portrayal of the original characters. They didn't totally change everything around. You could tell that there was some heart behind it. I've got to make a rant about the second movie, Star Trek Into Darkness. They introduced Khan, and see, the original episode, Space Seed, kind of got away with it. They cast Ricardo Montalban, who's a very Latino actor. He had an accent, and the character of Khan, first of all, Khan's full name is Khan Noonien Singh, which is very Indian, and he had in the episode, Ricardo Montalban wears like kind of an Indian. He has like his hair done back in a bun, like a ponytail sort of, and they depict him what he looked like centuries earlier, in more Indian clothing, and he was somewhat dark skinned. You could kind of get away with him playing an Indian. In fact, he's in the movie totally different from all this. In The Naked Gun, he plays, it's comedy with Leslie Nielsen. Go look that up. That is a good movie. If not necessarily all three movies, but especially the first movie. That is really funny. He plays somebody with a German name, and then there's a reference somewhere where, as a joke, his secretary says he doesn't like cops. He's into East German men. But here you have Ricardo Montalban playing an Indian in Star Trek and in Spacey, and then a German in The Naked Gun. It was something about his dynamism, I guess, as an actor. He could get away with that, I guess. But anyway, who's going to turn down Ricardo Montalban? Anyway, so all right, so Space Seed is recommended. Going back earlier in the series, earlier in the season, first season, The Enemy Within. I didn't really liken to that episode much, simply because the order. I liked the first few episodes, Where No Man Has Gone Before, Corbomite Might Maneuver, Mud's Women, and although I don't want to besmirch any of these episodes, especially in the first season, they're entertaining. All the episodes are entertaining. It's just that they dip down and some peak up in terms of my entertainment value from it. I tend toward more action and so forth. So yeah, Where No Man's Gone Before, The Corbomite Maneuver, Mud's Women, Enemy Within, Man Trap, and then The Naked Time is very captivating. So growing up, I thought of The Enemy Within and Man Trap as being like precursors, like warnings, alert, Naked Time episode is coming up soon. Remember, I was watching these 5 days a week, and so I could count off. I could literally count the number of days till a certain episode would air, because it was 5 days a week. You knew, today's Wednesday, they're airing episode 13, so Friday would be episode 15, and I knew which episode 15 was. So, but since then, The Enemy Within has grown quite a bit on me. I won't say there's only so much a story you could tell in 51 minutes. And of course, if you watch it in syndication when it was 48 minutes, because they cut out a few scenes, which became interesting when I watched it for the first time on video cassette. And I would see these extra scenes. It's almost like deleted footage being included. No. It was simply because it was cut out for time constraints. Stupid commercials had to be longer or something or other. I don't know. But The Enemy Within. All right, let me tell you about what has since fascinated me about The Enemy Within. I'll tell you right off the bat. It's based. It takes a premise of a science fiction idea. It takes an earlier science fiction idea that even kind of precedes that earlier science fiction idea. You've heard of what's it call it? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It takes that concept, and actually that concept goes further back. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes further back, but it takes that idea, and then it does a simple, clever science fiction aspect of it. Oh, I forgot to mention some of the technology. I mentioned the uniforms. I should mention the technology. You have, of course, the starship, and they kept it vague in terms of what powers the starship and how the starship moves through space. But within television constraints, there was a little focus on trying to get science-y or some kind of. If they couldn't make something scientifically accurate, it was clear they did their best to keep it seeming like actual science. So in the original series, how does the starship go through space? Well, they introduced dilithium crystals, or first they introduced lithium crystals, and then somewhere along the line they changed it to dilithium. But lithium is an actual element on the periodic table, like as of now, real science. And if you and this is the way it's shown in the series, in the 60 series, and from then on, there are photons that are shot through the lithium crystal, and dilithium would be, I guess, two lithium atoms fused together, so it's denser, and that makes sense considering what I'm about to explain. You have a lithium crystal, and you shoot photons through it. The photon would knock. You have an atom with, or you have several atoms together. It will bounce against the different atoms, and the more times it knocks and bounces off an atom within the crystal, it picks up kinetic energy. So the whole goal is to get the photons to build up kinetic energy. You want to speed up that photon so it becomes more energetic. You have an electromagnetic spectrum, and photons transmit the electromagnetic force. So you have frequency wavelengths, and the wider wavelengths indicate lower power, lower energy level. And you want higher energy level, for what I'm about to explain. So you want to boost that energy level of that photon towards the other end of the spectrum. And you might have heard of gamma radiation and so forth, gamma waves and so forth. Well, the gamma level is over here, and it means that the frequencies, the wavelengths, are going like this, as opposed to this, which is much weaker. So you want that photon to be bouncing off as many atoms within that crystal as possible to give it more push, bouncing energy. And so hopefully if you have it bouncing off enough times, it picks up and goes into the gamma wavelength level and shoots through. And of course there's magnetism that holds the beam together. Channels, focuses the beam. All right. So in the original series, they have lithium, and then of course dilithium would be, I guess, 2 atoms of lithium. So it makes sense that there's more mass, more opportunities for the photon to bounce against something. And then it talks about matter and antimatter now, and matter and antimatter pods. This is something in real science. What is antimatter? You have matter, which has a certain charge. And in the 1930s, I believe that's when they discovered antimatter for the first time. It's very, very expensive to produce, and it doesn't last that long in real science. But we have been able to create it. It simply means, okay, I'll explain it simply. You have matter, particles are made up of things called, it's been a while since I've talked about this. They're gluons, holding together, literally acting as glue, holding together these particles. I'm blanking on the name, but those are the actual fundamental particles. Anyway, fundamental particles with the gluons holding them together. Well, each one, quarks, they're quarks. Okay, so you've got, believe it or not, I'm not joking around here, there are 3 families of quarks, and is it 3 or 2 pairs? You have 2 pairs, 3 families. You have up quark, down quark, up, down, top, bottom, strange, and charm. And the top quark, the whole model was mathematically figured out, but they only discovered the top quark maybe around 1995 or something like that, something like that. It was a huge accomplishment. We finally nailed it down. This completes our whole model here. We've discovered all the quark. We've actually witnessed all the quarks. We knew about them a while back. We've actually witnessed the top quark. So they're like 1/3, negative 1/3, 2/3, negative 2/3, and so forth. So you have these different charges, and the atom itself, you simply add up the charges of each quark. And if it adds up to a negative number, it's antimatter. If it adds up to a positive number, it's positive matter. So the whole basic, in the 1960s, all that's explained is that you have matter and antimatter. This part is true. When the two collide or come in contact with each other, they annihilate. And what you get is, well, first of all, you get, if you're watching with special eyes or something in a lab, you, for splits of a second, hundredths of a second or whatever, millionths of a second, you see different particles suddenly at once, and then they vanish, and then you basically get a photon. You smash the matter and antimatter together, you get, hopefully with enough force, you get a high energy photon. Remember I said high energy, you want to get into that gamma wavelength level of energy. And so the Enterprise has a saucer section, has an engineering section, and then you have these two nacelles going like this. Well, those nacelles, it's not really been described carefully, especially in the original series. It's not really fully explained. It's just that that's where the matter and antimatter compartments are, or maybe they're in the lower engineering deck or something. We have somewhere in the ship, you have matter and antimatter colliding in a channeled way, and then you have this energy going out. And then I'm not sure if they mentioned the warp coils in the original series. They certainly did in the Next Generation. But that's not entirely what drives the Enterprise, what allows it to move apparently faster than light. You have matter and antimatter, and that creates energy that powers not only the engines but the whole ship. So, as mentioned in the in the original series, they just simply refer to warp factors, which is essentially a reference to Einstein's general relativity, theory of general relativity. Einstein had special relativity, and then about 1905, and then a decade later, he came out with general relativity. Special relativity is simply E equals mc squared. It means that mass is equivalent. Mass, if you accelerate it to a high enough speed, it becomes energy. Maybe flaking on the details of that, but that's a quick explanation of it. And so general relativity deals with how space-time... So if nothing can travel faster than light, then, and certain other reasons for this, you can unite space and time. So you think of like space-time as a single thing that's like a fabric that can be warped and twisted and so forth, and that's what we experience as gravity. So general relativity deals with how space-time can operate, especially around black holes, when you have a large mass and it's distorting and warping space-time around it, and so around a mass and so forth. I think that's pretty clear. So that's general relativity. So they talk about warp factors. The Enterprise, and it's not described clearly in the original series, but this is about as far as it goes in the original series. I'm excluding what fandom has talked about and how they speculate. Space-time essentially gets warped, and then the Enterprise moves through somehow. That allows the Enterprise to move. Now, expanding upon that, going outside of what's specifically talked about in the show, you can project that what the Enterprise is doing is that little by little, it's taking an area of space-time and it's distorting. A Star Trek fan who around 1990 or early 90s had been watching the show and had been curious. He mentions actually what episode he was watching. I know it was The Next Generation, and he was curious. Well, how would the warp drive work? His name was Miguel Alcubierre, and he reasoned that the Enterprise would be like a rug. Imagine like a toy on a rug. In front of the toy, you would bunch up, bunch up the carpet in front of the toy, and then the Enterprise doesn't have to move the entire length because some of that space-time has been bunched up. The Enterprise simply skips over that bunched up distance. It simply just goes through. And then after it's left behind the ship, that bunching up is then expanded back to where it was. That's the solution Miguel Alcubierre came up with, and he came up with some scientific, title for his scientific paper. It was in a journal, prestigious journal. It was something. But essentially, he could have simply called it "How Warp Drive Works in Star Trek." Came up with some scientific thing that doesn't sound like he got the idea from Star Trek. But that's really what he did. He said so. He said as much. So that's how the warp drive works. And even in The Next Generation, they use something. They talk more about warp fluctuations, and they get a little bit more technical along those lines. That explains the warp drive. Now, the transporter. You remember, there's that circular platform. Somebody steps onto the transporter and vanishes, and then reappears on a planet or somewhere else. Well, what really happened was that they in the original Bible for the show, Gene Roddenberry wrote, that the Enterprise rarely lands on a planet. And if you think about it, an Enterprise about the size of a naval carrier could not easily land on a planet and then lift off again, go back up. It would be easier if the Enterprise sent some shuttle or something down and then back and forth rather than landing the whole thing. And as he said, or somebody said in there, in one of the books about it at the time, maybe a memo or something, there's also the budget, the television budget at the time could not allow for showing the Enterprise landing on the planet and taking off again. It's just, wow. So perhaps he got inspiration from this movie. I'm just saying, there was a popular movie called The Fly, where I believe he's a scientist, pretty sure he was a scientist. There was a remake. I think the original one had Vincent Price in it, but and then there was like The Son of Fly and The Return of Fly, or whatever. There was a remake that was very good, directed by Cronenberg, I think is his name, David Cronenberg, starring. I think they were an item. I think they were married at some point. And I'm blanking on his name, but anyway, I think the year was 1986. They made a remake of The Fly. In some sense, it's arguable that that's better than the original 1950s movie. Anyway, he steps into this chamber and he tries to transport himself to another chamber, and a fly accidentally gets in, and the fly's head, he materializes with a fly's head, and the fly materializes with his head. So the focus is mostly on him with the human head on this fly, small head on this fly. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily what inspired Gene Roddenberry to come up with the idea, but it was certainly out there. So he came up with this alternate solution of not necessarily having Enterprise land and take off again every episode, but having them dematerialize and then rematerialize and then dematerialize, and it's like, well, it's essentially that. And it was never actually explained how it works, except in one episode in the third season, towards the end. um, just to show you how weird the show can be at times. I'm not saying it was camp. I'm not saying it was too weird, so weird that it's not entertaining. I'm simply saying one of the entertaining aspects of Star Trek is that it allows for imagination, and it has a lot of intriguing what-ifs that come in. There's an illusion of Abraham Lincoln that appears in space and then gets transported aboard the Enterprise, and he asks, essentially, how did I get here? And Kirk explains it's a matter scrambler. I think Kirk says it took the atoms, it split them apart, and then sent the atoms, and then reassembled in their original pattern. Now, there's an interesting book called I think it's called The Physics of Star Trek. I can't remember the author, but I think Lawrence Krauss. Yes, Lawrence Krauss wrote the Physics of Star Trek around I think 1994. It's a book I suggest you read at some point. It's entertaining. It takes aspects of the physics, the fictional physics in Star Trek, and tries to explain whether they could really be come about in our world, whether they could be. Is it real science, and how close does the Star Trek science come to real science? That's basically what it is. There's another short-lived science show hosted by Michio Kaku, who's also a famous scientist. I can't remember. I can't remember the title of that, but if you look up Michio, Michio Kaku, Kaku, you should be able to find reference to that series. The series lasted a short time. Each episode basically took an aspect of science fiction and explored like lightsabers and Death Stars and warp drive and transporters, and explained could they possibly work in real life, and how close could we possibly come to making something like that. So so here Gene Roddenberry has this idea, this solution, the transporter. So they beam down to a planet and they beam back aboard. I think you get the idea. It's basically like a fax machine. Trying to fax a photo. It takes a copy. It scans and it gets a sense of all the different units in the picture, and then it transmits it by signal. And then at the other end, there's another fax machine that receives the signals and the units and understands how to put them back in the original pattern. That's really what it is. So the transporter, and explained warp drive. I explained the starship in general. And you have the phasers, the tricorders. The phasers, there's a Model 1 and a Model 2. Basically, you have a handheld, it looks like a remote control. It's about the shape of a remote control. And it's basically a ray gun. Phaser, we had lasers at the time. Laser stands for light amplified, something emitted radiation, laser. And so he wanted something that sounded better. I think they referred to lasers in the cage, but after that, somebody sent a memo saying, look, we better come up with a more high-tech term than laser because we don't want to be limited to lasers. So they came up with phaser, and which stands for sometime later on, somebody said stands for phased energy rectification. It's a handheld thing, and you can set it for stun or kill, and there are different sets. Sometimes they refer to numbered settings, like put it to setting number 2 or setting number 4, and other times they just say set phasers to stun or set phasers to kill. Basically, stunning force means you're zapped with a beam, and then you're like disoriented, and it's enough to either knock you out, depending on how heavy the setting is, knock you out, or just feel woozy for a while, and it's enough to incapacitate you temporarily. And then kill, of course, means it kills you. there's still a body there. And then in the movies, they had in the Next Generation, they had another setting called Dematerialize, or I don't know, remember what it was called, but essentially your atoms split apart and you vanish, and that's totally, really, I mean, that's very scary. That's extraordinarily scary because you wouldn't even have a body to do an autopsy on. So phasers, and then that handheld thing can be fit into a larger pistol-looking object, and that's called phaser number 2. And there's also a communicator. Keep in mind, this came out before cell phones largely came. I mean, there's always some, you know, wise guy who's going to say, no, cell phones existed back in the 1920s or something. But I'm talking about mainstream use, public use. In the 1980s, a cell phone was like something like this big, and it was a narrow thing that you held to your ear, and it was very noticeable that you're using it. It was very, very, very limited in terms of what it could do. This preceded all that. A communicator is a small handheld thing you flip open, and that seems to activate the communicator, and then there's a dial, and you simply, it's a radio, you simply home in on a signal. You talk through it. It's essentially a cell phone, a 1960s view of a cell phone. And they also have, you see in the show, the computers are able to interact with you. Instead of punching buttons, they do have keyboards in the show, but oftentimes, especially on the Enterprise, you will see a character asking the computer, especially in the Next Generation, you see this in the Next Generation, computer, how long until shuttlecraft, computer, what is the shuttlecraft's remaining oxygen supply? Working, and then the computer would say in a female voice. The voice of that computer is the girlfriend of Gene Roddenberry, who played the first officer in The Cage, and then was girlfriend, and then she and Gene Roddenberry married around the time of the third season, end of the third season, somewhere in there. Anyway, she did the voice work for just about all the computers in Star Trek. She also played Nurse Chapel in the original series, and then Troy's mother in the Next Generation. It would be interesting if they ever had Troy's mother talking to a computer. That would be tricky. Anyway, the computer was sophisticated enough to understand and interpret human language, or Earth language, whatever that was. English, whatever. I should also mention when this series takes place. It was never mentioned in the original series. In Gene Roddenberry's original pitch Bible, it says it could be 1999 or even 2990, or it could be 1995 or even 2995. And I explained earlier in this video that it further went on to say, in other words, set far enough in the future where technology is comfortable and people can walk around in spaceships in shirt sleeve environments and so forth, but yet close enough to our century where they're recognizable human beings and relate as human beings. So the only references that it did make to our time was 2 centuries. In a few episodes, like Space Seed, it references 1996, and then he's been asleep for 200 years, and then they go back in time in Tomorrow Is Yesterday, back to the 1960s, and it says, I'm going to lock you up for 200 years, and Kirk says, that ought to be just about right, and there's even an episode in The Savage Curtain, the one with Abraham Lincoln, where somebody says, Scotty says, Lincoln has been dead for 3 centuries, and that was 1865. So it's been pretty consistent. It was 2 centuries so that would make it the 22nd century. Somewhere along the line, a fan fiction or whatever, I know it was in the Making of Star Trek book. It mentions the 23rd century. So somewhere along the line, it switched from the 22nd century indirectly to explicitly the 23rd century. So then the first motion picture comes out, and they specifically make reference to the 23rd century. And in the second motion picture, The Wrath of Khan, it starts off with a chyron at the bottom in the 23rd century. And if you watch the DVD commentary, you listen to the commentary while you're watching the DVD of The Wrath of Khan, you hear Nicholas Meyer saying that he put that in there to tell his mother when this takes place. Oh, it's in the 23rd century. It helps the rest of us, of course, ground it in the what century it was in. So, all right, so going back to the technology, the communicator, and then I've mentioned the phaser, and the computer. The computer itself. It's sophisticated enough to be able to understand commands like computer, what is the next calculated cycle? And the computer would respond in a female voice, and kind of computer robotic female voice. Then there's the computer, and then there are these cards, like these plastic. I want to say discs. These plastic rectangular square cards, and I've read that, or I've heard in a documentary that the one who was inspired at Apple computer, whoever, you know, those floppy disks that people put in, now of course things are streaming and we use the internet, but you may remember there were larger, flimsier floppy disks, and there were smaller floppy disks, stiffer floppy disks. If you're an Apple user, you're familiar with Macintosh, and they would use, I think, 3.5-inch floppy disks, and they were not necessarily, they were disks, but they were within a plastic square, and they were different colors. Wasn't color coded, just different colors. They very much resemble the ones in Star Trek, and I sort of remember somebody mentioning that he was inspired to make them that design based on Star Trek. I'll tell you something else about another inspiration. In Star Trek The Next Generation, somebody had seen an episode called Tin Man, a very good episode. I should actually go back to that recommendations list for The Next Generation. He'd seen a Star Trek episode where Data mentions he was listening to the computer just playing. Again, this is, I'll just describe this. Oftentimes in The Next Generation, well, sometimes in The Next Generation, you will see a character say, computer, play and then he'll mention a certain piece of music, and then you'll hear that piece of music being played. Doesn't that sound a lot like, what's that called? There's a computer system, I think that's connected with Apple too, and it's named, I think it's a woman's name too, but you know the device. Alexa, you've heard people say, Alexa, play something, or Alexa, what is today's date? Or Alexa, something like that. Very relatable now. And that's one of the things that I want to emphasize and make people aware, that Star Trek is very relatable. In Star Trek, the original series, these were futuristic concepts, like doors automatically opening when somebody is approaching. They had that. Now, of course, in the, I don't know, about the 70s, 80s, certainly, you had electronics eyes and so forth that would know to have the doors open so you can walk through. They had that in the original series. They had computer disks. They had flip phones. They had phasers and so forth. So that's like the window dressing. It's relatable. And if you get past the window dressing, if you get past the stigma of it being, so science fiction-y that I can't understand and it doesn't relate, the biggest problem I have, pet peeve I have, is with people who think Star Trek is unrelatable. Oh, it's made up and it doesn't relate to reality. No, and especially as our technology develops, it becomes more and more relatable to and appearance-wise relatable to our reality. If you look beyond the window dressing, you'll see a show about human drama, exploring what it means to be human, people working as a team, optimistic future, people having compassion, people trying to work out their problems peaceably. That's the essence of the show. That's a whole chunk of why I enjoy it so much. So anyway, going back to this episode, Tin Man, Data explains to a new visiting character that he was listening to a whole bunch of music all at the same time, but he's an android, so that allows him to be able to appreciate each piece of music played simultaneously. And so this guy had a computer background or computer background. Anyway, he was a professional. I believe he was a professional computer person. He wondered, well, how could that happen in real life? It would take so much computing power just even to play one song, much less like 3 or 4 songs at the same time. And then he thought, well, if I compress each song down, you won't have enough data to play a song with its full flair, with its full magnitude, but at least you get some sense of the song, albeit reduced and compactified. And he came up with the idea of MP3, or MPEG, way of contracting it down. So that's possibly how Data was able to listen to several songs at the same time. So that's one way in which, those are several ways in which real people have invented things inspired directly from Star Trek. Now I want to get back to the episode recommendations. Wow. Okay. So I left off with The Enemy Within, and then right back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I was talking about the transporter, and it splits Kirk into 2 different people. There's an aggressive Kirk and a passive Kirk, and it explores the differences between the two. Now, the reason I'm recommending this is it's a wonderful exploration of these 2 different sides. You have wonderful, what I would call soliloquies or speeches from Spock. At one point he says, being split in half is no theory with me, Doctor, because he's talking to Dr. McCoy. I have an alien half, you see, as well as a human half, submerged, constantly at war with each other. I survive it because my intelligence wins out over both, makes them live together. I mean, you get wonderful speeches like that in Star Trek. Like in Balance of Terror, the Kirk and the Romulan commander finally talk face to face, and at the end, it's clear that the Romulan ship has been found out, and it's over for the Romulan commander and his crew. And the Romulan commander tells Kirk, he's been acting on behalf of the glory of his Romulan government, and Kirk has been acting on behalf of Earth and Starfleet. And the Romulan commander says, you and I are of a kind in a different reality. I could have called you friend. And then Kirk asks, well, what good would it be to destroy your ship, in essence? And he says, we are creatures of duty. I have lived my entire life by it. And then he self-destructs his ship. It's a wonderful... And then there's a bit just after that, after the ship explodes on this view screen, there's a bit that was deleted from the final airing of the episode where Kirk goes like this. And I really wish that they would have... I can understand politically, I mean, if it was time-wise, that's one thing. I can understand politically and socially why they cut that part out, but that would have been wonderful. And I've seen footage in slow motion from the clips that have remained of William Shatner doing that. But wow, can you imagine like a Romulan enemy ship, in the 1960s, to have a captain, like the star of your show, showing compassion towards this Romulan commander, an understanding of him as a person rather than simply the enemy. That was some part of the whole episode, some point about the whole episode. Wonderful moment. But anyway, in The Enemy Within, Kirk and Spock are split apart, and also McCoy in The Enemy Within comments that that Kirk, it may be passive, but he also has the intelligence over his aggressive side. And McCoy points out, you see, you were braver to confront your aggressive side, and your aggressive side wasn't brave to confront you. He was cowering, and perhaps that's where where man's essential courage comes from intelligence. Wonderful moments like that. And so then there's then there's another pretty daring thing that I'm surprised and I'm glad that they put in the episode. If you watch the episode, beware that there's an aggressive Kirk that makes advances on Yeoman Rand and in her quarters, and very dramatic, very dramatic. You can tell what I'm getting at this point. I hope so. And it had been written in since her first appearance that he had a liking towards her, or there was something a deeper relationship that could occur. But he's also caught in the role of being a commander of a ship, and he can't show favoritism. He can't get personal with his crew, especially with an attractive yeoman, his own yeoman. He can't. It's like a boss and his secretary. You can't get that personal, or at least that could bring up issues. So here, the aggressive, when split in half, of course, the aggressive Kirk doesn't feel any resistance. He wants her, and he goes after her. So very nice drama. That's where I don't like censors coming in, broadcast censors and so forth. I'd favor showing the drama, what could happen. It's not moral. I'm not being moralistic. I don't want the show necessarily to always be the good guy. The characters always being good or whatever. I want to see the drama of what happens when this occurs. As an example, like a thought, speculation makes you. I'd rather be thinking than simply watch characters I always like. Then I want to also mention something about a meme. I don't know how far it's gone, but they've shown this meme on the internet of Kirk saying, "I'm Captain Kirk, and really dramatically acting. And people could point. I've seen at least one channel do this, and it's so stupid. The YouTube person pointed to that clip as saying, "Oh, look how campy the show was," totally missing the fact that in context, that was the aggressive Kirk. Simply, if you think of the Incredible Hulk, it's the aggressive Kirk who's been divorced, by the transporter accident, has been divorced from his compassionate, passive nature, and he's simply a seething body, even though it's still Kirk, seething body of needs and desires, and he simply goes after it. That's why he says, "I'm Captain Kirk." He yells out. It's not that he's campy. It's not that William Shatner is overacting or something. He's a bad actor, and that, by the way, has been overplayed too. That William Shatner hams it up in Star Trek. No, it doesn't. No, he doesn't. The only thing that they kind of got right was that sometimes he would speak a little slowly between his words. But even that has been exaggerated way too much by fans and by critics and so forth, people making fun of it. Another episode is shortly afterward called The Naked Time, and that episode, I'll just cut to the chase. There's this this micro liquidy kind of thing that once it enters into the bloodstream and it passes through the crew, it makes you feel like you're alcoholic. It brings out it lowers your inhibitions, it lowers your resistance, so you act out more, and it's a good exploration of people's inner drives and desires and wants and feelings, just driven, pushed out to the surface, and what problems could occur if you just let them bubble up to the surface. And that's what the Enterprise crew encounters. Like, that's what Kirk is faced with. He even catches it towards the end, where he has to fight against these wants and desires. Even in a critical moment, he's goaded Spock to help him, because Spock has already come down with this, and Spock isn't really thinking clearly. It's not that he's thinking clearly; it's that he's thinking nostalgically. He's sad about the fact he couldn't tell his mother that he loved her because of his Vulcan heritage, and then he's all mixed up in that. And Kirk is saying, "Look, the ship is going down. We're going to explode in like 30 minutes. Come on, you got to help me." And then he touches Spock, and then he starts coming down with it. And then he says at one point, he says, "My own yeoman, have you ever noticed her? A captain's not permitted." And then he stops. He looks around, he looks at the ship, and he says, "Now I know why they call it she. I can't," something like, "I can't open up to her," meaning the ship, "and it won't open up into my life. I've got to live hers." Which is a nice line, and that catches Spock off guard, and that's what gets him to think more rationally. Oh, there is a solution to this. It's a very interesting drama. And then season 2, of course, you've got to watch if you want to learn about Spock and Vulcans, who they are. Amok Time, the premiere episode of the second season, not the first one produced, that was Catspaw, but the first one aired in the second season, is called Amok Time, where they go back to Vulcan, and it's the first time that you really see Vulcans other than Spock being portrayed. And it's an interesting idea, and I would recommend, just simply for action and suspense and adventure and thrill, the Doomsday Machine has a lot at stake and a lot of good commentary. And I'd throw in the Tholian Web, and for the same reason, there's some sense of suspense and how much of a family the Enterprise, the crew of the Enterprise is. And there are loads of other episodes, but those come to mind. In The Next Generation, I'll mention, and then the movies are worthwhile too. And The Next Generation, the first season, you've got to watch Encounter at Farpoint, because that introduces us to this. It's their first mission, and it introduces us to the new characters, and that's a 2-part episode. And then there's The Naked Now, which is the same plot line as The Naked Time. In fact, they reference it back to The Naked Time. And Heart of Glory, which is telling you about, it delves into Worf's character and background, and Too Short a Season is interesting in terms of aging and the desire to, I think he takes a drug, he takes something which reverses his aging to the point where he's a young officer again. And that's another thing about Star Trek, where they introduce very science fiction-y ideas that complement or comment on human desires and foibles and frailties, and like unquenchable desires, like the desire to be young again, and what it costs. Like if you could find an alien civilization that offers you something that could reduce your age, you might take it, and then over time, of course, it's at the great cost of your heart hemorrhaging, and you could soon die. Would you rather be young for a certain length of time and then die, or would you live out your years gracefully? I should also mention, the series finale of the Next Generation, which aired in around May something or other. I'm pretty sure it's May 1994. And it refers back to, I mean, it's basically a sequel, not only a finale, not only of the entire 7-year run of the show, but it follows up from where Encounter at Farpoint began. In other words, Encounter at Farpoint was simply an episode introducing these characters and the character of Q. And then the series finale comments on the 7-year journey that the Enterprise has taken and how they've grown. And that's one of the themes, the fact that people's lives grow and so forth, and where is it going in the future. And it's a brilliant, beautiful story about Picard flipping timelines between the past and the present and the future, and how things can change. And one thing that we do now could alter our future for the good or for the bad. And it calls back, it refers back to events in Encounter at Farpoint. In fact, when he goes back in time, that's the past event. He switches between, like haphazardly, switches between the present and that Encounter at Farpoint, or right before Encounter at Farpoint, and then the 25 years in the future. And it's about loyalty of the crew together and so forth. Also, on top of that, it's a brilliant science fiction story itself. It's like, what if? And it reintroduces Q. Well, Q is a magical character that's in the Next Generation in about at least once every season, and he like tests some aspect of humanity. And he starts off in Encounter Farpoint as representing the Q, as saying that humanity doesn't deserve to be in space and it should return and stay on Earth. And then over time, when he's introduced, you can tell the episode will be testing some aspect of humanity. And then the finale, it's a great episode. I'm trying not to give away too much, but it's testing humanity in some sense, some aspect of humanity. But he comes across as more constructive, and in some sense, trying to help Picard, as opposed to simply being a negating force. So, let me see. So there are a lot of episodes in there. I should also mention an episode in the second season of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which seems very limited in terms of budget, but it's very excellent in terms. Very excellent. It's excellent in terms of the thoughts brought up, philosophical debate brought up. It's called The Measure of a Man. I mentioned earlier that Data is an android that is made to resemble a human, and there's a scientist that comes aboard. I believe I don't know if they call him a cyberneticist, but he's a scientist that I think he actually works in cybernetics. Anyway, he wants to disassemble Data, and because he thinks he's figured out how Data's creator created Data, so he wants to test it out and see if he can replicate Data. So you're not only dealing with the ethical issue of whether the large thing, whether Data is an actual person or whether he's a property of Starfleet that can simply be ordered to be disassembled. There's that. There's the issue of slavery, and it's ironic, kind of. I'm sure it's it's hard to imagine it wasn't on the eyes of the writer or people involved that you had Whoopi Goldberg, who plays a recurring character in the show, who's black-skinned, telling Picard or noting, trying to get Picard to recognize the real issue, which is you'd be creating a whole race of people to work as servants. I'm sure that's got to have been recognizable. That slavery aspect has got to have been recognizable by somebody. Then there are probably other issues in that episode that I can't remember, but those are the main parts. The Measure of a Man. Tin Man is a wonderful episode too. That's in the third season. A lot of the third season, I'd say the first season, first three seasons are very good. I don't want to besmirch the later seasons, but the first three seasons are very good. And I guess I've talked as long as I should, so I'm going to wrap it up now, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget, if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and like this, because as they say, it should help with the algorithms. And for me personally, I like to see the number of likes in these videos going up and the number of subscribers going up. So I'll have a good day, and I'll see you next time.